Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome back to another episode on Boys in the Cave. This episode is sponsored by Human Appeal Australia. If you plan on giving your sadaqah zakat, consider Human Appeal. Human Appeal Australia are helping Palestinians by actively providing displaced families with freshly hot cooked meals, vegetable baskets and clean water. So check out the links in the show notes to donate to Human Appeal Australia, inshallah. So today we have a very, very special guest, someone that I've been seeing and following online for a while now. So Habeeb Akande is a British Nigerian writer, sex expert and historian. He is the author of 7 published books on race and sex in African and Muslim cultures. His main research interests includes women's sexual rights, eroticism, and the female orgasm in Islam and African cultures. As a public speaker, erotologist, and cross-cultural sex educator, Habeeb carries out workshops on the clitoris, kunyaza, and female ejaculation at international conferences and leading universities. So, assalamu alaikum, Habeeb, and welcome back. Welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for inviting me, brothers. Hope you're both well. I just want to add, I've studied Islamic law as well, just in case, because the bio was, mashallah, it was amazing, but then even I was thinking to myself, this guy just sounds a bit like he just talks about sex. So I've studied Islamic law formally, both in the UK as well as in Egypt, and in Azhar I studied primarily Maliki fiqh, but also studied comparative fiqh and usul fiqh, which is extremely important. And then I studied and came across erotology when I was in Egypt. So there was it wasn't straight into sex and intimacy.
Alhamdulillah, like people can also, check out your previous episodes you've done in other platforms as well, where you kind of talk from the Islamic perspective. So that's what I wanted to get you on as well, because I think that the way that, alhamdulillah, on Boys in the Cave, we talk about certain discussions, and the way you've explained and articulated this topic with the nuance that it requires, there's a lot of similarities in that sense. So I'm like, I definitely have to get you on to talk about very pressing issues, like when it comes to marriage or sexuality in Islam, or all these kind of discussions are very, I wrote it actually in my notes, like it's very like almost Victorian era type mindset, like we've taken from the Christian understanding as a result of, I don't know, westernization or whatever it may be. And then we've sort of just copy pasted onto Islam and how we view Islam. And we can talk about a lot of it. But I know that before we started recording, Nadeem was actually sharing something regarding the controversial nature that it gets termed when we can talk about these sort of topics. And all on top of that, I guess your personal experiences when it comes to, not personal, sorry, but stories you've heard from others when it comes to, understanding sexuality within Islam. So would you be able to just share that before we kind of, give the mic off to our guest?
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think I think my immediate reaction was when you sent me the introduction, Habeeb's introduction was, sounds great. If a little controversial, I think is what I said to you. I.e., I think when people kind of hear that introduction, it shouldn't be controversial, but I think we have that kind of reaction from our community when you talk about sex and eroticism and this sort of stuff. It's just like, hold on, you can't talk about that. That's not like, not something that's done, right? Until like you're man and wife, and then you kind of like just figure it out without any help. And I'm going to bypass, I think, I'm going to bypass the discussion about why it isn't controversial, because I think people are, I'm going to give the listeners the benefit of the doubt to kind of be adult enough to understand actually it is a discussion we need to have and to understand everything around that. And I want to get into something else, right? I think from my point of view, and I'm by no means an expert, so I really welcome your views on this, Habeeb, is, again, stories I've heard that Tanzim was alluding to, is, you have imams, for example, who are married and yet their wives are complaining. And these are true stories. I've heard that their husbands are going off on a boys' trip and packing sex toys in the suitcase, right? And it's a boys' trip and they're going off to wherever and then they're coming back. Literally, I think nowadays, again, literally, not I don't mean that in the actual kind of like literal sense of literally, you have plane loads of brothers flying to Morocco so that they can do the Misyar marriages and then come back. And it's a real kind of, like, I don't know how to describe it, but it's a real problem. And I think it does come from that misunderstanding of sexuality, sex, and understanding not just like what it is, but understanding our own kind of desires, emotions, and sexual needs as people. And when we, again, I'm not by no means an expert, so I'll ask the question to you, Habeeb. But like when we kind of refuse to talk about that or refuse to engage in that, it seems to me that that's when you try and like seek alternative avenues for that kind of sexual pleasure or sexual kind of expression, right? And so we do have this hidden or maybe even like open secret where you have brothers kind of abusing this. I think we're going to get into some of that later on with the du'at and so on and so forth. So I won't get into that right now. But I mean, yeah, I mean, that's the question. What do you think? Is this something that you've noticed and come across?
Yeah, most definitely. I've noticed it since when I first probably came across it when I went to Egypt, moved to Egypt around 2006. So you had brothers coming from the UK, the US, and other parts of the world engaging in these type of like Misyar or secret temporary marriages, and also some people that were students of knowledge and also some religious leaders. And that's when I was kind of first shocked by it, because I was thinking to myself, some of these brothers come from westernized countries where, you know, dating is the norm and things like that, and some of them were married, but then they'll engage in these sham marriages in order to basically justify having sex without having a guilty conscience, or kind of like halal sex. And what oftentimes what happened is that the women were unaware, and what effectively, what in many cases it was a form of prostitution, because in some cases you have a woman or her parents, sorry, are prostituting their daughter, and you have men who are coming over having, you know, are married for like a couple of weeks, and then another man will come like a couple of months later. And it was something that was known so much so that many of the scholars spoke about it, and some of the scholars that I studied. And that's why I was always wondering, why are they doing this in the form or in the name of Islam, or they're using Islamic law and fiqh to justify it. And then I heard about, you know, like the it's sex tourism. Some people call it halal sex tourism, that happens in Morocco, and it also happens in Indonesia as well. There's actually a town in Indonesia which is known just for that, like where people come, especially men from the Gulf, to engage in some of them, they call it Mut'ah, some of them call it Misyar, but it's all some sham marital arrangements in order to have sex. But in according to them, they think it's halal and legitimate, and because in many cases they have a scholar or some scholars who've given it, like you could say, the religious stamp of approval. But I would say, in addition to, like, I agree with you, like in many of our communities, we don't have open and honest conversations about sex and sexuality. We also don't have honest conversations about ethics and marital ethics as well, and relationships. And the reason why I like to speak about ethics as opposed to like the law, the legality, because most people know what is halal. Well, like, most people technically know what's halal and what's haram. They know zina is haram. So what you find is people doing all of these legal loopholes or these sham marriages to kind of justify whether it is a form of prostitution or a form of illicit relationship, or to have sex behind their wife's back and not even thinking about the consequences. Even like I've come across cases where brothers have taken a secret wife abroad, contracted a STI, and then gone back to their wife who's unaware, and she's contracted that same STI, and then the brothers are guilt shaming the wife and accusing her of sleeping around. And these are things where, and some of these people are knowledgeable and quote unquote religious. And I say quote unquote because I don't like to ascribe such behavior to the religion, but the fact that this type of behavior is becoming more prevalent, and it's now being popularized and spoken about in mainstream platforms. Because when I came across it, I didn't really talk about it publicly, because it was kind of like a secret amongst maybe certain, like you could say, religious leaders or some students of knowledge or some people who in the know-how. But then in the last 3 or 4 years, it's now become people openly promoting. That's why I think we need to definitely like really address it, because it's destroying homes, it's destroying the reputation of Muslims, is destroying the faith of many women, and especially like breaking up a lot of families. And a lot of the men that are doing this, like, again, it's not, if they were engaging in illicit relations, consensual, that's different. But these are all like very like dubious, and because again, it's they might be technically halal according to some scholars, a number of religious authorities won't call them out, and the brothers themselves will think that they haven't done anything wrong, and you can't call them out because you can't speak about, obviously that's their personal business, if that makes sense. But it's just, again, people's understanding of what marriage is, what marital ethics is. I think that's extremely important, because I want to be completely honest with you, I find more and I'm saying generally, I'm not speaking about Islam, I'm speaking about Muslim practices. I find more integrity amongst non-Muslims in terms of relationships than many Muslims that are so-called practicing and religious, because for a number of Muslims, again, not all, but a number of Muslims, unfortunately, they view marriage as it's just a way to have sex in a legitimate way without earning the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So marriage, and if you were to ask a lot of people what is marriage, especially for a lot of the brothers, marriage is just a contract. They use the fiqh, dry, legalistic explanation of fiqh. It's a legal contract which allows me to have sexual fulfillment with my wife as long as I provide, financial maintenance. Whereas if you speak to a lot of women, Muslim women, they have more of a Quranic understanding of marriage, that it's a sacred union. It should be based on love and mercy. There should be tranquility. There should be mutual pleasure for both the man and the woman alike. And that's how Allah speaks about marriage. So that is from within our tradition. I'm not using the Hollywood model or non-Muslim or Western model that some people would say. This is the Quranic model. How Allah speaks about marriage is a sacred union. It's a firm commitment. It's not something that should be taken lightly. Right. Whereas when you read a lot of the books of fiqh, and they're valid as well, don't get me wrong, but the way a lot of, because again they're jurists, they're lawyers, so they're speaking about like the legality of the marital contract. But for a lot of Muslims, that is what is taught. So when they think about marriage, it's just about the contract. It's about the rights and the duties. So when you've got that framework, that mindset, that's why you will find, again, people would do engage in these like nefarious practices, but they will say it's okay because a legal jurist, a scholar, a faqih hasn't said that it nullifies the marital contract. But in the essence of how marriage should be understood, like a relationship that should be based on trust, love, there should be safety, should be mutual respect, you wouldn't behave like that even with like friends. But again, I think some brothers, the way they view marriage is that it's there for procreational purposes or for the man to fulfill his sexual desires. And then in terms of to fulfill his lust and for enjoyment, like you mentioned, like the boys trip and stuff like that, that's when you go and have either a second wife or you have like these Misyar and secret marital relationships. And again, what's more troubling is that it's coming from people who are knowledgeable of the deen. That's why if it was just people that were uneducated, that's completely different. But it's people that are knowledgeable or somewhat knowledgeable, they're abusing classical fiqh as well, and they're abusing certain interpretations and putting into practice to kind of like just have these like sham marriages. And again, like I said, it's important for women to be aware of what's going on as well, because she also needs to know of her rights and also just understand the mindset of some of these brothers, that they have justified that this behavior is completely legitimate. And these same brothers will chastise and abuse non-Muslims for engaging in intimate relations outside the marriage, but it's consensual. People know, they're not hiding. It's not as if like, so that's what for me is more troubling, is the mindset, and a lot of it comes down to like the ethics and people's morality, as opposed to like just being knowledgeable about Islamic law, which again I think that's quite problematic, the way people approach marriage in Islam, and they have a very utopian and idealistic understanding of male-female relationships. And also, like you said, there's not enough conversations where people can hear actually what's going on. So that's why it's good. In a way, it's good that some of these things are coming to light so people can actually understand really what's going on. And then if they're looking for a prospective spouse, or if they're in a marriage, they can kind of understand or detect some of the signs. Because,
it's interesting. And I want to pick up on the ethics point, because I think that's so important about not just like the actual ethics of it, but the ethics that we think we have. So I was recently began studying the hikam of Ibn Ata'illah, right? And one of them, I'm by no means qualified to discuss this really, or like give any, but one of them, he says, you commit a sin and you despair because you've broken your self-image rather than kind of broken that connection with Allah, right? And it seems to me that a lot of the times when we talk about sex and engage in that conversation, and a lot of the times that these kind of the brothers that are doing these actions, it's because they have a self-image of who they are and who their wife is, and yet they have that feeling within them that they want to, explore other kind of sexual appetites, and they can't break that ego, and they can't break that kind of place or pedestal that they've put their wife on, and therefore they go and engage in kind of like extramarital or misyar to kind of fulfill that appetite.
And that also plays into, because I've spoken to a couple of psychologists, and they mentioned about the whole concept of the Madonna whore complex, and you have that quite a lot amongst people in religious communities who engage in like illicit relationships, where the way they'll view their wife is, you know, like the Madonna figure, being someone who's saintly, wholesome, someone to mother of your child, so you treat her with respect. But the whore is the figure or the woman who you desire sexually, the woman you want to have fun with. And for a number of men, they see that these two archetypes of women are completely separate. So if a woman is a quote unquote good woman, a good Muslim woman, she wouldn't engage in some of the behavior that you find is sexually desirable. So that's why they would try and seek that out from a girlfriend, an escort, or a second wife that will be that sexually desirable being for them. Whereas the Madonna figure is the public woman who's your legitimate wife, but again, there's certain desires you don't have for her. So it's an internal battle that even a number of men that are facing, both within the Christian tradition as well as a number of Muslims, especially Muslims who come from a very sex negative culture where sex is not really spoken about. And actually, to be clear, it's not really sex; it's pleasure, because people are having sex, but they're not maybe enjoying, they're not being gratified and having sexual pleasure. So that's also one of the things. And some men, they find it very difficult to have that honest conversation with their wife. And there are some women who've been raised in a very conservative and somewhat restrictive culture where they believe that there are certain acts that, even though they may be halal, that's not befitting for them. There are some women, I've coached some brothers who say that some of their wives believe that it's completely haram and forbidden to engage in oral sex, or for her to wear certain clothes like lingerie, because that's seen as a clothing for a lady of the night and things like that. So these are all stuff to unpack as well. So if the man himself is not able to be open, even with his wife, and enjoy intimate relations halal, that's why some men, they look at it like, I've got no alternative but to go outside, and whether it's in the form of a second wife or having an illicit relation. Again, it's not to justify, it's just trying to understand the psychology, because even people that engage in like these secret marriages or these Misyar arrangements, I believe in most cases that they're coming from a good place, in the sense of they believe they're doing the right thing. Because if they really didn't care, they wouldn't even engage like in Misyar. But in their understanding, this is halal, this is legitimate, and in their mind, they're protecting the wife because they think the wife can't handle it. If he was open and say he wants to take a second wife, or he might lose his children. So these are things that a lot of men are wrestling with. So again, it's not to cast aspersion against the men completely and saying like they're really bad individuals. Some of the things that they're doing might be bad or problematic, but it's also trying to understand that this discussion needs to go both ways. It's not just a case of, because sometimes, and also it might be what's being sold to the women, because in some communities, especially where polygamy is not common or it's not normalized, and you don't have open discussion about sex and intimacy, a number of women, they go into the marriage thinking or believing that it's going to be monogamous, and that's the understanding that she has. Whereas the brother has been taught from a relatively young age about polygamy and the benefits or the joys of having multiple wives. So that's also what he wants to do. And maybe he gets to a stage where now he can afford to take a second wife, but then the wife just totally can't understand or comprehend that. So then he feels he's got no alternative but to take a second wife, like secretly. So again, it's one that, again, unless we have honest conversations on both sides as well, and being transparent, and there should be integrity in the relationship, and not looking at marriage purely from a legalistic perspective. Because what a lot of brothers will say is, as long as it's halal, meaning it's the marriage contract is valid, then what I'm doing is correct and is sound, even though it might destroy my wife and destroy my family. They think that they're completely, it legitimizes their behavior now. And I think that's problematic, because, and again, it's not always about halal and haram. Like even the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when someone asks like, how do I know what is righteousness and what is evil, or what is bad, was unrighteousness, and he said that to consult your heart. Istafti qalbak, walau afta nas, that consult your heart to know what is good, what is right, even if everyone is giving you fatwa, even if everyone's giving you an opinion. So consult your heart. And if you feel agitated, if you feel this doesn't feel right, then that's probably something that is bad and evil, you should leave it. So, and that's why I find with a lot of these issues, it's not a case of someone needs a fatwa or needs a scholar or a sheikh or a molvi to tell them what you should and shouldn't do. It's a lot of them is to seek from within. Ask yourself, is this something that you think is right? Is this something that you think the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, would do? Because again, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, brothers, it's only when I entered, like you can say, the so-called, because I wasn't I don't like to use the word practicing. I was raised Muslim, alhamdulillah. Some parts of the religion I found more difficult to practice, I would say, than others. I would pray, but I'll go to nightclubs. I won't drink alcohol, but I'll smoke weed. I'll have a girlfriend, but I won't do such and such. So again, it's not. I was still a Muslim, but if you were to ask me, I'm saying those stuff are haram. But there's some stuff. But I was open in terms of what I was doing. I knew what I was doing. But then when I started becoming a bit more religious and studying, and I'm going into like religious spaces among students of knowledge, and the way they're speaking about marital relationship, it shocked me because amongst my non-Muslim friends or non-practicing friends, they wouldn't behave like that. If they wanted to, it's like they respected the sanctity of marriage more than many so-called practicing knowledgeable religious Muslims, because the idea of marrying a woman just to have sex with her, that just boggles my mind. And a lot of my so-called non-practicing friends and non-Muslim friends, that boggle their mind. Whereas I'm having conversation with so-called religious people who have memorized the Quran or given khutbahs, some of them are imams, and they're justifying this. And I'm thinking, what about the risks, the STI risks to your wife? That's not in the Sharia. What does that mean? What about the emotional damage? What about the reputation of the Muslims if you engage in these practices and that comes public and that's seen as normalized? Oh well, that's not part of the conditions of a marital contract. We don't follow the West. We follow the Sharia, and it's just like it's a very simplistic and backward understanding of our Sharia as well. To think that formulaic approach is something which is what Allah intended, and that's something that again I think we do a disservice to the religion when we speak about marriage like that. When something that someone who is a commoner, a layperson who hasn't studied will know that is wrong. But you're having so-called religious figures who are justifying it. That's what I find more. And they'll say things like, "Oh, in the West, they're all promiscuous and they have side chicks and girlfriends." That's not true. Because even in the West, if you're in a relationship or you're married, and usually just say the man steps out, usually that's the end of the relationship. Obviously if the woman finds out. So to have this idea that it's acceptable for a man to have multiple sexual partners or a woman to have multiple sexual partners, that's not the norm in the West. Like we have to be honest as well. Yes, they don't consider premarital sex to be impermissible, but that doesn't mean that they allow, like most people are comfortable with polygamy or open marriages. But if you are going to do it, there should be consent, obviously on both parts, and there's transparency. Whereas the way a lot of Muslims are trying to preach these types of marital arrangements is that as long as the second woman's father knows, because he's the wali, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if my first wife knows. Do you understand? And that's just it's to me that's wild, and that's why those views need to be challenged, because they're losing a lot of people, especially again the last year or so. A number of these scandals have come to light, and people are really now questioning it. And the people that are people of religious authority, they're oftentimes relying on the words and statements of our respected scholars of the past, rather than going back to like the Quran and what the Prophet peace be upon him saying about like morality and ethics and transparency. They're just always going back to and relying on the fiqh books.
Yeah. It's really interesting you say that actually about kind of non-Muslims and their relationships, because we do paint this picture of, like you say, you're promiscuous and this and that, whatever have you, and like, and truthfully, I find I don't know if I'm going to get slack for this. I find the relationships between the genders for non-Muslims much more they're much more germane, they're much more like natural, and we just don't have that. We just like maybe now in some of the younger generations, but my generation, 36 millennial, kind of like we just didn't have that, right? And we were kind of on the outside looking in on these like non-Muslims and being like, almost with envy, I want to say, but I mean, that's a problem in itself, right? That's a kind of like an issue.
Did you have because when I used to find, how can I describe it? The Muslim relationship in ISOC, so in Muslim spaces, was problematic. Right. So it's like you'll find a Muslim man, even a Muslim woman, but generally like a Muslim man, he can interact with opposite sex and again be cordial, be respectful. It's completely fine. As soon as you go into like so an ISOC is Islamic. So I don't know what you have in Australia. It's like in college or universities, like Islamic society, right? A Muslim MSA they call it in the US.
MSA they call it, yeah.
If you have like an Islamic environment or like an Islamic event, all of a sudden the men and the women as well, but the men like feels awkward. They don't know how to interact with the opposite sex. So it just feels more awkward, and it's because of this, like everyone's talking about like fitna, temptation, and that's drummed into people's minds. So every woman you see, she is a potential source of sexual temptation, and you're going to commit zina, so you have to stay away from her. Whereas you don't have that understanding with non-Muslims. So that's why, again, and a lot of it is, and some of it as well, then it comes to a point where the people that are pumping this into the minds of especially young people is performative piety, because a lot of them, they know that they're just, especially for those of us living in the West, whether it's in Australia, the UK, USA, you're going to interact with the opposite sex, so you can't bring rulings from scholars of the like 12th century, 15th century, which you might be completely segregated, or another part of the world where again it might be completely segregated, and try and implement that into modern day Melbourne, London, or Chicago. It just doesn't work. But that's the way people are presenting or portraying Islam, or even the way of going about getting married. And when people talk about things like halal dating and stuff like that, and it's like they'll give all of these rules, but if you actually read the classical books of fiqh, it doesn't go into rules in terms of how to find a spouse.
Right.
And that's something that people need to understand. Even the Quran, Allah oftentimes will use the word bil ma'ruf, do like orders to do that which is known to be good, known to be like fair. And that's something that is contextual, depends on the culture. So it's not something that if someone were to say, how do I live with my wife? And Allah says, وَعَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, live with your wives in that which is known to be good and kind. That varies from context, culture to culture, time to place. And it's important that people understand that, because you, rather than adopting what a scholar, like I said, has said 600 years ago in Baghdad, for example, or in Cairo, and trying to implement it into today's day and age, it just doesn't work. And I think that's where a lot of people are struggling, because we're studying these classical texts and not realize that many of these texts need to be contextualized as well. And I mean, the fitness stuff, I don't know. I mean, because maybe because again, I'm in my 40s now. So a lot of, before when I was younger, I should just sit there and be like, okay, yeah, but I knew that a lot of it was performative. Whereas now I kind of more speak my mind. And again, because I've seen the anxiety and the sexual schizophrenia it's caused a number of people where they think this religion unpractical. It's just like, because they go into 100%, or they think, this is what the religion teaches, and they burn out. And I've seen it so many times, and this is a really unfortunate thing. Like when you're maybe newly practicing, so to speak, or new into the deen, you can do it for a period of time, but then after a while, people will look at, I've had brothers like who are questioning, because they're speaking to a woman, are they a kafir because it's haram? They haven't lowered their gaze, or they're shaking a woman's hands, and they're comparing shaking a woman's hands as if it's in the same level as committing actual fornication.
Right.
Now, whether you believe it's haram or not, but it's still, you can't compare the two. And this is just something which people need to understand. Is like, again, I know the climate which we're living in, but you have to not only have the conversation, but also understand that some people, and one of the things, if I'm going to be completely honest with you again, is that some of the preachers and scholars, you have to understand that a number of them are living in a bubble. Because if you're a scholar, you can pray your 5 daily prayers, usually always in a mosque or an imam. You live in a like very conservative environment. You're not interacting with maybe non-Muslims as much as the everyday Muslim. So the version of the Islamic way of life that you've read in the books and you're studying, you can live that somewhat, but most of the population can't. So you have to just also be realistic in terms of what you talk about, and that's something which, again, even for our imams, much of what they, and I feel for them again, because I know of a number that I used to study with, and they would tell me most of the questions they receive is nothing to do with like what we studied. It's about pastoral care, it's about counseling. And that's why now a number of them are coming up and saying they're relationship experts. Now, one of the challenges with this, and I'm sure Brother Nadim, you probably heard this from your wife, you said is a therapist who's trained in this, is people speaking about things that they're not qualified in. So you have scholars, you have preachers that will be diagnosing someone as a narcissist, diagnosing someone as addicted to porn, addicted to sex. They got this problem, and it's just like, these are clinical definitions. They shouldn't be given by a layperson. If you're not trained, you're not supposed to diagnose someone that way. And similarly, because someone has been married for a number of years, it doesn't mean that they're a counselor. It doesn't mean they're a good counselor or a therapist. So I think even our religious leaders need to respect other sciences as well, whether it's psychology, and these others. And I don't like to say Western sciences, but these other sciences which are crucial for their role, because a lot of what they studied, and this is again, it's quite hard to know this. You can imagine you spent like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years studying these like ancient sciences, learning and memorizing so many books, and then you come back to your home country and no one gives a damn about all of this. So if anything, you need to like start creating up a frenzy, and like so people can be worried about the conflicts that was going on during the time of Ibn Taymiyyah or Al Ghazali, or because that's where you can shine. But if we're talking about real day issues that people are going through, it's a culture shock for you, and you haven't even been in that environment for a number of years, and that's why even for those individuals it's very difficult. But then they're also thrust to be, you're in this position of leadership, you have to now deal with all of these people's issues. We're not just paying you to read the salah, you're also supposed to deal with and that's why I feel for a number of imams. So it's two ways. It's one, what is expected of imams, but also I think imams and scholars need to realize that there is help available in the Muslim community, and the help might not come in the form of what you expect. So if you've got someone who is trained as a licensed psychologist or a therapist or a counselor, and they're trained, just because they don't fit your ideal of what a Muslim should look like in terms of maybe wearing niqab or hijab a certain way, or beard a certain way, or his trousers up to his ankles or whatever, it doesn't mean you should dismiss his knowledge or dismiss what he can give you. Do you understand? Because that's also something that I think it's changing somewhat. I think people are kind of now warming to collaborating with other professionals and realizing that I can't do everything myself. But also I think the Muslim population needs to understand that what is a scholar, or what is a scholar's expertise. And when people think about a scholar, like a religious scholar, is generally, my understanding, is someone who can give fatwa, someone who can give a legal ruling. That doesn't mean that they can give advice on marriage, sex, finance, show you life advice, life coach. It doesn't mean that they're an expert in all of these things. But I think for many of us, the way we look at scholars is as if they're next to prophets. They're the inheritors of the prophets in terms of the sacred knowledge, like the Quran and the Sunnah. But in terms of applying and contextualizing all of that, not in every case of an expert. And I think they also need to have somewhat of humility to understand, okay, I don't know this is outside of my lane, this is outside of my field. If you want to learn the Quran, if you want to learn about some of these hadith, I can talk about that at length. But if you're asking me what should you do in a marital situation, or what should you do because you think your son is addicted to porn, or this, that, like, that's out of my, I'm not, unless they have studied it, you can talk about it. But other than that, you should kind of, like, delegate that to someone else. I mean, Allah knows best, but I just think that it's two ways, because again, I feel for the scholars and the religious leaders, because they're bombarded. Like, some of the questions that they receive, it's too much. Like, it's not the quantity, but these are real, like, issues that people are facing, and you expect the person to give an answer within, like, without knowing all the facts and circumstances, within like a couple of minutes. And it's just, again, for every other profession, we respect other professions. Like, if someone's a lawyer, if someone's an accountant, you're not just going to go up to a lawyer, an accountant, and expect to get an advice straight away. I say that because obviously I'm a chartered accountant and I work in corporate, so I understand there's processes and stuff, and you have to respect people's time and their expertise. Whereas, again, for whatever reason, with our religious community, do we respect our scholars in terms of understanding what is a scholar, who's a scholar? And also, some scholars, they might say incorrect things. It doesn't mean you need to take it. Scholars are human beings, they're not prophets. So just to understand, to humanize them is extremely important. And then also, I think for the preachers as well, I think maybe we need to calm down with this idolizing the Islamic past and presenting this utopia, because that never existed. It's never existed. It's not like it's only the last 20, 30 years or whatever that we've now come into marital issue. There's always been conflict, even during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I know people like to talk about the gender war, the gender divide between men and women, and feminism and toxic masculinity, but there are examples I can give you within our tradition. There's always been tension. Maybe not as pronounced as this, but there's always been tension. But there's always been people who are able to help and try and explain some of these issues, obviously according to the best of their knowledge from the Quran and understand the prophetic sunnah.
I
Sorry, I wanted to ask, because it was interesting that you mentioned about MSAs, and we have that phenomena where the guys are like very shy and act very awkwardly with the opposite gender, and there's lack of interaction. And it's funny because you have that, and then suddenly you expect those same guys to just get married and bam, just move on with their lives. Like, how can you not, like, you don't actually know how to interact with the opposite gender, and then suddenly, I think Islamically we're told to like get married early and this and that. So like in that situation, like guys are trying to get married early, and it just doesn't make sense, like the whole timeline of it all. So it's interesting that that phenomena does exist, and men don't know how to actually interact, what to say around women, or what their needs are. As you mentioned earlier, like men basically are looking, I think Muslim men are looking at marriage as a halal way to have sex, basically. And I guess we can address why that's the case, why this phenomena exist. Like we've already talked about the conservativeness of how we portray our tradition. It could also be how pornified everything is in today's day and age. So there's, we can kind of address that. But then at the same time, I do think, and this is a conversation me and my wife have a lot actually, is that like, when me and my wife, we do this thing, try to watch Love is Blind. It's a very popular show on Netflix and stuff, and we watch it together so that we can try to understand the psychological dynamics between couples, and it allows us to kind of have conversation about, why do you think she acted like this, why do you think he said that, if there's conflict. So it's a good way to kind of bring out good discussion. But all in all, I always found like this goes back to the conversation around Western women, not Western non-Muslim women, and there's this perception that they're all loose and not serious and sleep around. Obviously, that can happen, but when it comes to marriage and when they're serious about marriage, they're very mature. They know what they want. They're very idealistic about what kind of life they want to live when it comes to marriage, and having kids, like all that sort of stuff is very important. And you can see time and time again, like a show like Love is Blind, like any Muslim can go and watch it. Like just about every single girl that's been there and has gone the distance, so to speak, like has always been very serious. Like there's no like ifs or buts, like you can tell they're serious. And then just about many guys are not actually that serious, they're not that matured. And I think that kind of reflects as well with the Muslim community, where guys are just not aware. Like I talk to people now, like many guys are looking to get married or in university, and they talk about how I have to get married and this and that, and then I kind of break it down, like why do you want to get married and this and that. Usually I'd say it's it's more to fulfill the nafs, right? Like they use marriage as a way to just fulfill the nafs, which is having sexual relations, right? And so I kind of asked them the question, like, look, why do you know your own attachment style? Do you know your love language? Do you know how to deal with someone that has this kind of conflict? Do you know what to do? Like, do you know what women's needs are in this way, emotion, like? And they're like flabbergasted. They don't even know, like, how, for example, maybe trauma from childhood can have influenced the way that they behave, and that be projected onto a relationship. Like all these sort of, I guess these conversations are very basic conversations amongst many non-Muslim people in the West, to be honest. Like, and I guess for me, that was the literature I kind of had to delve into in order to gain that. But it's not something that's really that discussed within Muslim circles. Like it is, I think the tide is shifting slowly. Alhamdulillah, with the right people, like we're trying to really elevate many psychologists, Muslim psychologists, and they're giving us that information, all that kind of stuff, which is good to hear. At the same time, I do think there is, it's that problematic nature of viewing marriage in such a way to just fulfill the nafs, and then we just kind of get into that situation, and then you see like all these problems rise up from this kind of situation. So yeah, I think I don't really have a question, but I don't know to share your thoughts about that. But I think it's just this whole phenomena is very problematic, and we just have to unpeel the layers and kind of get to the depth of why this is happening. And as you mentioned, like it's that ritualistic mindset, or just that kind of black and white mindset of like what's halal, haram, and then what we have to do, what we don't have to do. But then the ethics and that conversation, or the maqasid of the Sharia, is like missing. Like, and it was a really good example you talked about when it comes to the heart, and really taking a moment to pause and reflect and feel like, is this right? Like, does my heart feel comfortable with this? Like we talked about the Misyar marriage, and I will probably get into the technicalities of that a bit later. But these things shouldn't sit well, because there's a level of like deception, there's a level of hiding, there's a lot of like these kind of behaviors are not healthy, they're not normal. I would say, like they won't foster a very healthy relationship with your spouse. And so I think these are all aspects that really need to be taken into account and addressed as well. And yeah, just not, I think it's very convenient for the Muslim community to just be like, yeah, these are how non-Muslims act, so we are actually better because we do it in a halal way or something like that. We have this halal institution. And I've seen many, like, actually, I don't mind mentioning, like, Ali Dawa always talks about it. I don't know why, like, I always see it pop up, like, talks about how polygamy is an institution because the West, and they have, they sleep around and there's mistresses, and this is a halal way to kind of fulfill that need or whatever. But it's like, I'm a bit gobsmacked, to be honest, because you're just using polygamy as a solution for something Western that you're perceiving to be as a solution in that sense. So I think we can probably get into that as well. But yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts on.
No, you said a lot that I agree with. Not agree with everything you said. To be fair, it's like the whole, and again, especially for those of us living in the West, we are from the West, we live in the West, and I don't understand the way people talk about, oh, the Westerners are like this, we as Muslims we're this way, and it's like, no, we're very similar in terms of, okay, yes, we may not have like illicit relations as much as maybe they do, but in terms of being people of integrity, being people that are honest and being trustworthy, that we should, because if I'm going to be completely honest, you have that more in the West, generally speaking, than in many Muslim majority countries, unfortunately. Now, again, it just takes me back to my days like when I was in Egypt, because oftentimes, like one of our teachers, he always used to speak about the West, and the Western women are loose and the white women are this way and that. And I asked him, have you ever been to England? He said, no. I said, how do you know? Oh, just what people say and from what I watch. I said, what are you watching? Certain blue movies. So I'm like, how can you take those movies that you're watching and a few people's conversations that maybe have gone to the West and had certain relations, and now you're saying all of the women are that way, or even most of them are that way inclined? It's crazy. It's just like someone going to, I don't know, like a holiday hotspot, like Ibiza or somewhere people go and party and say that's how all women are like. And that's what happens to a lot of these brothers, or these brothers who maybe when they start practicing, they come from a background where they maybe were promiscuous, so they were dating multiple women, or they're in the the nightclub scene, and they say that's how all women are like. And it's like, no, you're speaking about a certain type of woman at a certain stage in her life, maybe late teens, early 20s, who is maybe like dating multiple women, but that same woman 10 or 15 years later, you're probably not going to be behaving that way. But for whatever reason, they don't seem to see Westernness, and we're Western as well. That's the thing, but Western non-Muslims as people that have morals, that people who want commitment. And again, like what you mentioned, and I agree, like it's good to understand the psychology, because the way a lot of non-Muslims, I would argue, the way they view marriage is about commitment. Whereas I think, and lifelong commitment, that's why for a non-Muslim, when you hear like someone who's been divorced like 2 or 3 times, they're in shock horror, because in their mind it's like, if you're getting married, and again, this comes from the Catholic and Christian understanding of marriage being a sacrament, they look at it like this should be for life and you can't really get divorced. That's why it's hard to imagine someone who's been married 2 or 3 times, even in Western society. So they'll look at someone who's had 10 or 12 girlfriends or relationship, that's fine, but very few marriages. And they look badly on someone who's had even 2 or 3 marriages. Whereas in our tradition, it should be, again, I'm not saying that it's okay for someone to have multiple divorces, but you shouldn't look down on someone who's been divorced. But the same way we look at, so that's why we're trying to use the Western model in terms of marriage being a lifelong commitment, but doing it within an Islamic frame, which it kind of doesn't work, because the way we've been raised is that you get married really young. A lot of the brothers, they're just getting married because they want to have intimate relations. They're not aware of, like what you mentioned about the love languages, the attachment styles. They're not aware of women might have trauma. They've got emotional needs. They're different to men. So seeing them as, no, this is a woman just going to fulfill my sexual desires, and anytime I want intimacy, I'm just going to call her and she's going to give it to me. And it's just like, that's not realistic. Anyone who's been married for a period of time will know that's not realistic. But that's what they've been told by even some religious figures. So they're saying, and then they'll use certain hadiths, weaponize certain hadiths, and they'll be saying to them, why aren't you giving me intimacy? Not realizing there's so many reasons why a woman, it's not because out of she doesn't like you out of malice, or there's certain reason why she's tired, she might be exhausted, might be hormone imbalance. There's a lot of reason why she's exhausted, why she's not up to it, and it's for that also needs to be taught as well. Why women refuse intimacy, because again, the issue is that the women oftentimes have been educated in terms of the attachment styles, love languages, what marriage should be from an Islamic framework, right? Whereas the brothers, a lot of us, our education of what intimacy is or what marriage is just purely about carnal desires, and it's all about our needs. So you're getting a mismatch. Whereas I would say with the non-Muslims, they're more aligned in terms of what the expectation of what marriage is. They both don't understand what it is. So when someone is getting married, they both are going with the intention this is going to be a lifelong commitment. Whereas if you're getting a Muslim woman who's going to marriage thinking this is going to be a lifelong commitment, this is going to be like my soulmate, my best friend, like someone I can be vulnerable with, but the man is just looking like, no, this is someone I can have halal intimacy with, be a good mother for my children, but I'm still going to live my life. I don't have to tell her about what I'm doing. I don't have to be, like brothers are even asking questions like emotional intimacy, is that halal or haram? It's like, that's not like the fact that even like, do I need to be emotionally intimate? Is that a right on her? Because I was told that as long as I give her food, shelter, and clothing, I'm fulfilling my Islamic rights. I'm telling you, these are the kind of questions that brothers asking. Like, why do I need to provide emotional intimacy? What is that? That's from the kuffar. That's from the non-Muslims.
Oh my
That's
God.
not. So you've got this, and these are men that are in their 30s and 40s. My wife is always complaining. She's why is she complaining for? And it's just like they're understanding again of what, and again in Islamic marriage, because if I'm speaking to brothers, if I'm speaking to Muslim brothers, I will use the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he was emotionally available, where he was considerate to his wife's needs, where he even didn't marry a woman because she couldn't take polygamy. So not this whole idea that it's all about his needs, where he was cognizant of women's needs. So these are things that men should understand as part of our tradition. So I will talk about all of these concepts that maybe women are familiar with or talking about, like love language, attachment styles, but link it to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because those brothers cannot refute if it's coming from our tradition, but they're not maybe aware of it as such. So they only see or hear about the side of, I've got the right to intimacy. If she doesn't give me intimacy, the angels curse her. I've got the right to have up to 4 wives. They're not aware of what underlines that it's a responsibility. Not underlines that, yes, even when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was encouraging people to get married early, it was also the understanding was that the men are going to be committed to those women. They're not going to be, as the Prophet described, he said, Allah doesn't love the the tasters, the people that just marry, have intercourse, and divorce, the people that just abuse or mock marriage by just having like the muhallil and muhallil lahu, like the people that just marry to make a woman permissible so another man can marry her. And these are things that, again, because the way people view Islamic marriage is problematic. Because again, if you didn't have the understanding, you wouldn't even think like these things that a Muslim would do, let alone someone that's trying to justify it. So, but again, I think it's important that we're having these conversations. But I think for Muslims in particular, the men, sorry, we need to link it back to the Quran and the Prophet, peace be upon him, in terms of those love languages, attachment styles, that him being emotionally available and stuff, so they can see that in the Sunnah. Because if you're just speaking about Western psychologists and non-Muslims, a lot of brothers unfortunately will dismiss that, to be honest with you, even though there's validity in what they're saying. But so that's the starting point. And again, the reason why I say link back to the Quran and the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, because you won't find many classical scholars talking about this. They'll speak about, in a lot of the fiqh books, again, they're speaking about the legality. But in terms of like the ethics and the morals, well, I saw it more in books of like erotology and stuff like that, and they're not books of like law. And that's what I kind of use to try and first have the conversation, and then to kind of open people's minds to them, for them to reflect, to be introspective in terms of the way they view marriage, the way they view women, the way they view intimacy. Because again, I'm quite optimistic, although there are a lot of issues. I think that we are making progress, because at least we're willing, at least some of us are willing to have the conversation, and to the point where when someone is talking of speaking about marriage, it's just like very transactional. They look very archaic, and people laugh at them. For the younger people, and this is where it's slightly worrying, but I don't really work with younger people, I work with adults. The younger people are more impressed by that. So like with the whole red pill, the whole Andrew Tates and stuff, most men are, I think, over the age of, I would say definitely over 30. We just look at him and see he's either a grifter, he's just this is comic relief. He's not being serious in what he's saying, and they can take some of the benefit and seize the humor if they find it humorous, or the entertainment. They're not going to take those are like life skills. Whereas a number of younger men, not only teenagers but younger men, are quite impressionable in their early 20s. They believe everything that like him and the likes of him saying in terms of how women are in relationship advice, not realizing that this is just like it's entertainment. They're looking, it's like watching Fast and the Furious, thinking that's how you're going to learn how to drive, or watching WWE and you're going to learn how to fight. That's the problem, is that the younger people are a bit more impressionable, and this is where they need other, probably maybe male role models, or to have those kind of conversations that, yeah, I can understand why you're attracted to that or why you find that funny, but know the difference between what he's saying is just comedy or it's just nonsense, and what is actually things that you can actually benefit from. Because I don't believe in completely like censoring people or like canceling them or saying everything what he's saying is rubbish and it's evil and it's wrong, because whether we like it or not, he can appeal to a demographic that many people can't, and people are benefiting from some of what he's saying. And then it's trying to look at, okay, why do you benefit, like maybe in terms of the discipline side or being accountable, because maybe, or even because of his image, they respect that. The same way, if you've got like a personal trainer like in a gym and he's morbidly obese, no matter what he says, for most people they're not going to look at that person and be like, I can take life lessons in terms of how to be healthy from that individual, even though what he's saying might be true. But if you've got someone who looks in really good shape, you're more likely to listen to that person. So that's also being honest with ourselves as well. And again, not expecting the sheikh or the religious scholar to be able to, because now you're seeing like talks online about Islamic masculinity and Muslim masculinity, and it's like everyone's now, I think, like just trying to fill that void. And it's like, do we necessarily need our scholars to try and be that ideal Muslim masculine Muslim when, okay, I was going to say something. Let me hold my. I don't think they can tick all the boxes. Put it that way. Know what you're good at, know your lane, and kind of like stick to that. I think that's the, and then obviously use the messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as an example. But I just don't think, yes, Muslim scholars or preachers now jumping on these trends, especially for younger people. I think it's older people can more digest maybe the content of what the person is saying, especially if they respect the individual. Whereas with younger people, they're more like, okay, I want to see it, and then I will then believe listen to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were saying, Nadeem?
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, when it comes to people that are studying the deen, and this is personally my experience, I've been very jaded with my experiences with them when it comes to these conversations, because they see in a black and white ritualistic mindset of Islam, what's halal, haram, and sometimes the maqasid of the Sharia gets missed. So when we talk about societal dynamics or relationships, all this kind of stuff with them, because I can be a bit forgiving, because I guess from a scholarly or psychological standpoint, when it comes to categorizing, like even for myself, like I'll be categorized according to the academic standards of psychology as a highly sensitive person. It's called a HSP. And so for me, naturally I picked up on emotions and had that emotional intelligence, all that kind of stuff. But I always found, and then obviously learning the finer points of psychology would have required me to read more about it and kind of add on to top of what already came naturally to me, as opposed to someone that maybe logic is very easier to them to understand or utilize, and for them, like they didn't have to go out of the way to kind of formulate, understand concepts within logic, because it came more naturally to them. So for me, I can always give someone from a scholarly background benefit of the doubt, because I feel like the people that get into scholarship and students of knowledge who are very, mashallah, doing really well and are very good at studying are very specific type, where those kind of people tend to, and this is from my experience, lack emotional intelligence. They tend to lack that understanding of looking at things from that lens, and they're very logical people. They're a bit, they like to look at things black and white because of their kind of temperament and the way that they view the world and view themselves as well. And hence they project that sort of way of looking at Islam in a way where it is black and white, where it is, I guess I'd say historically has been very nuanced. And so for me, the Islamic institutions have failed because they should understand or highlight that these are the type of people that will gravitate towards being students of knowledge, number one. And number two, there should be things in place for them to be balanced so that they can pick up on that kind of emotional intelligence side of things and do that work as well. Because I actually spoke to a lot of people, like, shout out to Ustad Muhammad Ishaq. He's based in UK as well, where I've learned temperament knowledge from him. And we've talked about, like, for example, before even studying, for example, many back in the past, historically, the way that Islamic knowledge was taught was akhlaq was taught for a while, and then you actually hit the books, so to speak. And within that kind of phase of learning akhlaq is where you do that kind of work on yourself, where you understand or balance yourself when it comes to someone that might be very logical, kind of becomes a bit more, picks up more on the emotional intelligence side of things. So I think that process is totally absent. And so that's why I tend to, not feel as comfortable within certain circles of students of knowledge, because I know that that's what they're severely lacking. And then obviously becomes dangerous when those are the people that are on the mimbars and kind of giving fatwa and all that kind of stuff, but they don't have that nuance or balance understanding of deen in the way that it should be done. So I just wanted to add that point as well on top of everything that you've been saying regarding students of knowledge and all that kind of stuff. But I also wanted to get into the technical side of, because I know we mentioned words like Misyar, polygamy, so it'd be good to kind of break it down, because maybe a lot of people won't know what Misyar is. But I don't know if you had any comments to add to what I just said before I kind of shift towards that topic.
Yeah, just to add, I appreciate what you said, and it's made me reflect. What I would say though, also for some people, like when you're studying, like I mentioned, you can be in somewhat of a bubble, and you don't realize, because again, what your world is amongst, again, your teacher and your fellow students, everything is like more or less intellectual. And also another thing you have to realize, that when you're studying, obviously you've got reverence for the scholars that you study, and you don't want to say something, and generally the way you're taught is that you don't say something don't give a fatwa other than you've got another scholar that can back up what you're saying or cites an opinion. It takes a while even for people to have the courage to be like, I know this is a scholar that I respect, but I don't agree with that stance. Even to say that publicly, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. Like, it took me, I'm in my 40s, it took me maybe to say openly, publicly, I respect that scholar, but I don't necessarily agree with that, maybe to my mid to late 30s. And I've heard other scholars, they're saying something similar, like even where they get the confidence to be like, not to insult a scholar, just to say that I don't agree with that, even to say that because you've got reverence of our scholars, the way the institutes, the way they teach is that, again, you're not supposed to even question something that they've said, even though it's completely unacceptable in this day and age. You can say, okay, maybe that might be valid in the past, but in this day and age, it's it's not suitable, it's not applicable. But I'm saying, even it takes a while for you even to get the confidence to even to be like, you know what? And that's something that I've noticed, that people who haven't studied, it can be easy to say that, they see things as black and white, but this is what they've been told. This is what is from the Quran. This is from the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So they don't want to go against that. Whereas people who don't have that knowledge, they're just going by their understanding. So you hear people say things like, I don't know, let me talk about something that for some people might be controversial. No, not too controversial. Okay, like I'm from Nigeria, right? From southern Nigeria. So cousin marriage in my culture is not the norm. Is very rare, right? I was explaining to my mum a couple of years ago that no, Islamically you're allowed to marry your cousin. Now, from her cultural context, that's like marrying your sister. It's haram. I said, don't say it's haram. You have to be very careful. So but she's just speaking from, how can you marry your cousin? That's haram, because culturally it just doesn't happen. But it's allowed. Maybe in your culture you don't want to do it, that's fine. But to say it's haram, you have to be careful with that. Someone who studied wouldn't say that. Do you understand what I'm getting at? Or likewise, if someone were to say, and that's where the whole misyar, which we'll talk about, because they know that from a technical perspective, there's validity to it. That's why they're careful. They don't want to say it's haram. because they split up the marital contract, but maybe what they're doing is wrong. So even myself, I'll be very careful with certain words, but a lot of Muslims, they don't know the difference between when someone says something is haram and maybe just to say you shouldn't do it or it's wrong. Do you understand what I'm getting? And that's also, it can be like a straitjacket when you study as well, to be honest, because then you are even careful with what you say because you don't want to be seen to be saying something that is going against what many scholars that you respect and studies have said. This is like this is their understanding. So, but anyway, we can talk about that maybe another time. But I did like what you said in terms of the temperaments and the people that study, and generally they can be quite logical and see things in black and white. That there is a lot of truth to that. Whereas people that maybe study more of the humanities and see the nuances. Yeah, I agree with that. I can't dispute that, to be honest. I'm not going to deny.
Because naturally, when it comes to studying and being a student of knowledge, you need to sit down, you need to listen for a long time, you need to like analyze. Like these are very specific things that a very certain archetype of personalities would be naturally good at, as opposed to someone that might be on a different spectrum. It could be even like ADHD or that kind of stuff. Like they may not necessarily find that comfortable. So I think that kind of personality types will naturally gravitate towards, becoming students of knowledge. Not to say it's all the same. I'm not saying all of them are the same personality type. But I'm just saying in a general sense, that's just what I've observed, and it's kind of worked out in that way, and hence why that EQ or that emotional intelligence is lacking. But yeah, I wanted to get into Misyar, but I don't know if Nadim, you had any sort of comments or thoughts you wanted to share before I kind of break down or get into Misyar specifically.
That's one thing came to mind actually. I think with Sheikh Ali Adamgir about a year and a half ago, when it was like this whole Misyar shenanigans like really were at the head in the UK. I mean, he gave a lecture at Kilburn Mosque, I think. I saw it online, where he basically said, "Look, it's a distasteful thing to do. Like you're right. Like what you're saying, Habib. Like you can't say it's haram outright, but it's distasteful. Like you just it's not something that you would do. I can't remember the example that he gave now, but it was like, I can't remember the example he gave. It was brilliant, but it's just such a distasteful thing to do, and it's not befitting of a Muslim to do that. Well, technically, you can't say it's haram, but you just don't do it. It's not a done thing. Like it's not, and it plays into that thing about haram and what's kind of like ethical, quote unquote. Obviously, halal and haram is ethics, but kind of like what's good manners and good practice.
Yeah, he's lecture. I posted it a couple of times because it's brilliant, mashallah. And he's one of few imams and scholars that I've seen openly speaking out about it. And because he also studied in Egypt and Azhar as well, he saw, because again, a number of the scholars were speaking about it because it's commonly practiced, or was more commonly practiced in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. But he saw it firsthand and the destruction. Whereas in the UK, what's happening now is what people that were in Egypt and Saudi saw like 15, 20 years ago. Do you understand?
Right.
But that's why, again, you can see the passion in his voice and him speaking about it because he knows what it's caused. Whereas the brothers who are like promoting it and stuff, they maybe are either unaware and they don't realize what they're getting into. And especially, I would argue, in the non-Muslim environment, the harm is even worse because in a Muslim environment, it's like people like you're protected by, this is a Muslim environment, so you're not probably going to lose your faith. A lot of people are losing their faith over this.
It's
A
true.
lot of people,
Yeah, it's true.
And that's also what the people that are kind of promoting it, they're not even realizing as well, especially doing it in like a deceitful way. But sorry, I know we kind of went into Misyar before explaining what it is. Tanzim, sorry.
I just want to say one thing quickly. Sorry, I know you want to move on. I just want to say, like, there's such an irony in some of these du'at, right, who kind of have built their brand around, we must protect the family unit, and feminism is destroying the family unit and breaking it. And then, like, you're going to do Misyar. I'm like, is that not destroying the family unit? Is that not destroying your children and your wife, like, stability of it?
But some of this is also maybe like, because a couple that I've spoke to like privately, I'm not going to say by name, it's also what they're going through personally. So a lot of the brothers, especially when they start studying or doing da'wah, sincere, sincere, they do it for the sake of Allah.
Yeah.
Maybe in their early 20s, maybe mid-20s. Some of them have had like a midlife crisis or come from a certain background, but then they're very sincere and they'll be speaking about all of these things in terms of the ideals and what Islam promotes about marriage and the family unit and this and the other. Now, then they get into maybe their late 30s or mid to late 30s. Some of them have like some of a midlife crisis. They might have issues in their marriage. And also when you're like a preacher, a da'i, you do get offers from women to have relations with you. And some of the brothers, then because they might have issues in their personal life, in their marriage, so they want to try and legitimize it. And also what happens is that a number of their scholars, their preachers, even encourage to take a second wife. Like you've had, there's a couple of popular that du'as that said, yeah, sheikhs have said to me, you should take a second wife. And like, a lot of these brothers, they're not even making, they're making just above minimum wage. A lot of them live in council houses. And no disrespect to anyone living in a council house, they're not. They're relying on the government, the benefits to fund their families, and then they want to take a second wife, and it's just like you can't even afford it. And this is something that a non-Muslim, it wouldn't even come to their mind, because like, how am I going to take another, family or another woman and provide for financially? It's just like it wouldn't even come into their mind. But a lot of the Muslims, because they will look at and what does, again, coming from a pure fiqh legalistic perspective, if you fear committing zina, then it's compulsory upon you to get married. This is what is mentioned in the classical books of fiqh, right? You won't find the Prophet, peace be upon him, saying it's not mentioned in the Quran, but this is what they derive, that okay, we know that zina is haram, illicit relations, obviously adultery is haram. So if you fear that you're going to commit adultery, then you should get married. So even if you're married, then just get a second wife, and then you get a third wife. And because these preachers, they're in the positions of power, in the sense that there are women that even offer themselves and say that I don't mind, I've got my own council house, you don't have to pay, provide me financial maintenance or stay with me, I don't mind doing this Misyar arrangement. And this is where they are very irresponsible, because even if a woman is offering this, even though it's technically halal, it's not going to last, it's going to destroy her, it's going to destroy your first marriage. Don't do it. It's like common sense. You don't need a sheikh or fatwa to tell you. But some of these brothers, well, maybe again because I've seen this in the 90s, late 90s, early noughties, and I've seen the destruction it caused to a lot of the du'at in their like mid to late 30s, and now a lot of them like off the scene. It's like history repeating itself. So I've seen it firsthand in terms of what's happened, and even some people have gone through that. They're not actually speaking out against it, but the problem is because some of them actually did it. Even some of like the ex-wives, that there was one brother who came out and talking about it. Then the women were like, "But you was the one that was doing it and encouraging it." No, but he was like, I know, I'm not saying it's right what I did, but I'm trying to, like help the younger generation. And again, this is where, it's just like Imam Alamgir's lectures, like it's brilliant. I mean, I've reposted like so many times. That's something that people really need to listen to and hear, because he explains it in terms of what Misyar is, how is. Do you want me to actually quickly just summarize actually what Misyar is actually? Sorry, because we're kind of
I think
I know
so.
you. But Misyar is essentially it means like traveler's marriage. It's not a classical term from classical fiqh, only came about in the last like 20, 30 years. And there's essentially two types of misyar marriages. There's one which is marriage with the intention of divorce. So a man marries a woman with the intention to divorce her, maybe after a couple of weeks, couple of months, but he doesn't tell her. And that's what a number of travelers or students of knowledge or business people used to do. And then there's also another type of misyar, which is the more known, is when the woman foregoes some of her rights to financial maintenance, right to housing, right to for the husband to stay the night, especially if he's got another wife. So this is the second type, is what is kind of more commonly known. And they again, it came about in the last 20 to 30 years, initially like in Saudi Arabia, where some say it was because some women were divorced, or maybe like in their 30s and 40s, who wanted companionship, wanted intimacy, but they couldn't maybe leave their children or didn't want to leave their family home. So they will say to the man that I'm happy to, marry you, but you don't need to provide me a house because you can't afford it. I've got a house, I've got money. We just need to have intimate relations, halal. And some of the men, because they asked the scholars, and because many of the scholars said, technically it fulfills the conditions of a marital contract, she's allowed to forego her right. And they use the example of the Prophet's marriage to Sauda, who during the marriage, she forego her right for the Prophet to stay the night with her, and she gave her night to Aisha, may Allah be pleased with them both. So they use it as an example that it's allowed for a woman to forego her rights. So that's why they say that marital contract, that misyar contract, where a woman forgoes some or most of her rights, is perfectly fine. Now, what a lot of people that are doing misyar, where it's marriage with the intention of divorce, or the second one where they forego their rights, oftentimes it's a cover for a secret second wife, or a secret relationship, or a temporary marriage. And a lot of them are in essence, they're mut'ah, they're pleasure marriages. But because, again, going to the technicality, what scholars will say is as long as the man doesn't say, I am going to divorce you, like in this particular dates, doesn't give a fixed date which they agree on, then it's not mut'ah. But the first type of misyar, which I mentioned, the marriage with the intention of divorce, many classical scholars of the past, like Ibn Qudama, they said that it's permissible. Because again, they're speaking from a legalistic perspective. That's why you see online, and the reason again why I'm saying this is because it's been promoted and you've seen it online as well, where scholars, especially scholars from Saudi, will say that, they'll quote and cite classical scholars and say that they said it's perfectly fine. There's a fatwa, there's a brother like from Belgium, 19 years of age. I think he's a new Muslim. He was saying, I'm struggling with my desires. Can I marry a woman? But I know that I'm going to divorce after a couple of weeks, couple of months. Then they started quoting all of these classical scholars saying it's perfectly permissible. So what are we doing to the perception of Islam? That's going to destroy houses, destroy homes, destroy the faith of a lot of women. And this is the problem where people, and especially with the marriage with the intention of divorce, if you were to ask anyone who has not studied, they'll automatically say it's haram, right? If you were to ask people that have studied, myself included, I'll be very careful from saying it's haram, because I know, like, technically in terms of the marriage contract, it's valid. And when you explain it to people, because when people will say, oh, but what about the hadith that actions are judged according to intentions? Yeah, that's true. And but in terms of the marriage contract, if we're looking at it from a legalistic perspective, the conditions of a marriage contract, because you can marry, like, and again, I explain it to people like this. If a man marries a woman with the intention to divorce her, but he doesn't divorce her, like he said, I'm going to divorce after 2 months. She doesn't know, but then he doesn't divorce after 2 months. Is that marriage still valid? Most people say, yeah, it's still valid. It's still valid. But if we go by what you said, that because of the hadith, actions are judged according to intentions, he had the intention to divorce her, but he didn't divorce her. So when does the marriage become invalid? Is it when he divorces her? Do you understand? So this is where, again, people need to understand and appreciate when people are, even when the scholars who said it's permissible, they're speaking about the formality of the marital contract, not the action of deceiving, manipulating someone. That's wrong. They're not saying that's halal. And this is where, again, brothers will pick some of these classical rulings and then implement it and say that this is Islamic, this is allowed. And this is a problem. And again, you won't find no evidence of the Prophet, peace be upon him, or any of the companions behaving in this manner, where they'll like take a secret wife or they'll be hiding a wife and things like that. But a lot of these come from conversations or discussions amongst jurists, classical scholars, where they're debating some of these matters, like, is the marriage contract valid? And again, they're looking at it from the perspective of, if someone has done this, they still want to, because again, if you were to say that marriage is not valid, then imagine a man who's married a woman, had a relation with her, then 6 months later he divorces her. If you say that that marriage is not valid, then essentially you're saying that they both committed zina. And that's a whole raft of issues. Do you understand? Whereas if you at least say the marriage is valid, then that was still a legitimate relationship. Although she was deceived and it's wrong, but they're still, like you could say, protecting the sanctity of that marriage. But a lot of brothers, they don't understand the perspective where these scholars are coming from, because they're also trying to safeguard the honor of people who've been deceived. But again, if someone's intended to do that, they'll probably will tell them, no, you don't do that at all. So again, it's just understanding, like, like there's the hadith of someone went to Ibn Abbas and said, is there any tawbah, is there any repentance for murder? And he told the one person no. Then the second person came and he said yes. And then these students asked, why is it you gave two different answers for the same question? And he said, the first person, I said there's no repentance for murder because I could see in his eyes that he wanted to kill someone. Whereas the second person, I saw tears in his eyes, meaning he was remorseful. He probably committed murder, so I didn't want to deter him from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, this is understand Islam holistically. I don't know, like the morals. It's not just, the dry rulings and trying to implement it. And this is, but the whole misyar is, again, it's just really interesting because lay people, and you see obviously like the comments online, especially obviously the women, they can't understand that people are even thinking like this. But the reality is there are a number of brothers who are not only thinking like this, but they are promoting it. So like the story you mentioned in the beginning, or of the brother going, is it to with sex, a suitcase
Yeah,
of
yeah,
and stuff.
yeah. That's right.
And I'm sure amongst the brothers, they don't even see it's wrong or unethical or immoral. It's just, it's halal. It's perfectly fine. It's like, and that's what it's the mindset that probably needs to be called out.
Yeah.
So, how was Misyar practiced during the time of the Prophet, and how is it used now? I mean, you've already touched on how it's used now, but in what context was Misyar revealed during the time of the Prophet?
There wasn't a concept of misyar. So, like I said, it's a traveler's marriage. It only came about in the last 30 years. So, this context, even the word misyar is a new modern Arabic term. So, even the classical books of fiqh, they didn't talk about misyar. They spoke about marriage with the intention of divorce. With the intention of divorce. That's what classical scholars. But during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, you didn't have these issues. And again, just actually, it's important for people to realize if you look at early Islam, is very different in terms of the way marital relations were understood. There was healthy interaction between men and women. There was transparency. Obviously, polygamy was normalized. Having intimate relations, obviously, with their bondswomen was normalized and socially acceptable, but it wasn't in abundance. Now, when Islam moved outside of the Arabian Peninsula and started to conquer different, especially when they moved to Iraq and started to conquer different parts of the world, the Muslims that is, then you saw an influx of enslaved women, and that changed the demographic of even male-female relationships. So you had men that had multiple sexual partners by way of marriage and also by way of concubinage. So much so that Al-Jahid, who was a scholar from Iraq in the 9th century, he wrote about it, that some of the scholars of his time, and again, this is the 9th century, so this is within 300 years after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he was saying some of the scholars, they were saying that it's perfectly fine and permissible for a man to have multiple sexual partners by way of buying and having sexual relations with their concubines and passing the women along. But a woman who's been divorced like twice, they will say that you shouldn't marry her. So even in his time, this is within 300 years of the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he was seeing the morality, and he was talking about some of the scholars, he was calling them out. That why is it that a free Muslim woman who's been divorced once or twice, you're saying that she's like of lesser value, so to speak, to marry, but you have no issue with a slave girl who's, for all intents and purposes, being passed around by various male masters, but because they're halal transactions, then it's perfectly fine, and they saw it as legitimate. So he was calling them out from an ethical perspective. He wasn't using, like, obviously he's appealing to obviously the Quran in terms of like about being just and having ihsan, but he was appealing to something that people understand, like about ethically that's completely wrong. But you had a number of scholars that would say no, Islamically it's allowed. And even like around the 14th, 15th century, you had in the Ottoman period, there was a practice where some scholars were doing this, and some scholars were calling them out, where people would marry a slave girl. So, for example, you've got two individuals, Zayd and Omar. So Zayd will purchase a slave girl from Omar for $100. So now he owns a slave girl. He have relations with her. It's halal. It's legitimate. Then, after just say 2 days, he will sell that slave girl back to Omar for $80. So what is it? And that was a practice. So what is that effectively? It's prostitution. So what they were doing is, because Omar has made a profit of $20, he sold this woman for a period of time, like leased her, so to speak, but the other man has had intimate relations. Now, if you were to, and this is what some of the scholars were saying, is that I think some of them were Hanafi scholars, that from a pure legalistic perspective, it's legitimate transactions, but it's clearly what they're doing is immoral and it's unethical and it's haram. Do you understand? So these are examples, like you find these examples even like again in the 14th century. There was a scholar called al-Madkhal Ibn al-Hajj. He spoke about these practices where men would do the muhallil, tahlil. What's that marriage that's prevalent in the Indian subcontinent?
Halala.
Halala. And and he's speaking about it, that this was like, and people were making money out of it. So he wrote his book speaking about this again, against the Sharia, this is wrong, this is unethical. So what I'm saying this to say that as much as people like to romanticize our Islamic past, you did have these nefarious practices. You've always had these, but you've also always had people coming out and speaking out and saying this is wrong and condemning it. So it's important and clarifying what the religion says. I think the difference of people in the past, I think people kind of knew it was wrong, and a lot of people wasn't trying to justify it. Whereas nowadays, a lot of people obviously don't know I don't understand like what Islam actually says, and they think that some of these practices are wrong. I mean, also are Islamic, and that's where it's even, I would argue, it's even more dangerous, because there's one thing, someone doing something that's wrong and they know it's wrong. And they think, obviously, inshallah, I'll stop and I'll seek I'll seek repentance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there's another thing when someone's doing these practices and they think it's, or they might think it's perfectly fine, but other people think that this is fine. And this is like this is kind of like what's happening with these kind of all these type of like marital relationships, where the way it's been taught, especially to impressionable people, they think this is completely like Islamic.
It's interesting you say that. That people knew it was wrong back then, but it was still prevalent. Like when you look at some of the old kind of not like religious texts, but other texts, like like Alf Layla wal Layl, 1001 Nights, right? Not the Orientalized version, but you have this so much in that kind of text. But they're also like at the same time that I would have been like it's wrong, but we're gonna kind of do it and we're gonna like seek repentance. But there's always that undercurrent, and there's always like this one passage that sticks in my mind that I think really drives it home. It's a story that has Muhammad. It has Harun al-Rashid, right? He's like he's gate crashed a party or something, right? And they're passing around alcohol, and he's like, "No, I can't drink. I'm on Hajj." And they accept that as an excuse. They're like, "Okay, fine, yeah, we accept that. You're being religious, and like you can't." So they know it's wrong, and yet they're kind of like dealing with it in a way where it's like, "Okay, it's prevalent. We're going to do it. We're going to kind of seek repentance and kind of like respect religious boundaries anyway." Whereas it seems like now it's almost like we don't think it's wrong. We're just trying to find that loophole and like it's okay for us to do it, and not kind of dealing with the fact that it is unethical. But yeah, that just came to mind. It's really interesting you say that.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned 1001 Nights, because and that's is again it's important for people to understand, and it's a brilliant piece of literature because it shows that book, as well as like The Perfumed Garden from the 15th century from
I was
scholar
going to
Muhammad
mention the
Nafs.
Perfume Garden as well.
The reason why those two are very important, because you have, again, if you read books of fiqh, they are talking about like the law, what in ideal world, so to speak, it's not reflective of what's going on in society. And that's what people need to realize. So when you're reading a lot of these books by scholars of fiqh, even some scholars of tasawwuf, of Sufism, they're not necessarily talking about what's actually going on in society. They're talking about maybe like ideals, or what people need to do to reach these ideals, or to live a halal or legitimate like life. Do you understand what I'm getting at? Whereas when you read the books like The Perfume Garden, 1001 Nights, you're thinking, what is going on? Because these were a lot of the issues that were going on in society. Likewise, the book I was referring to, by Ibn al-Hajj al-Madkhal, he speaks about all of these practices like that, but they wasn't, again, because what I think modern day Muslims find shocking is that people will be engaging in like these illicit relationships, like in The Perfume Garden. The longest story, there's about a slave called Darumi or Darum or something, and this is a black guy, he's a slave, and he's just committing zina with so many beautiful women. But then he's also saying, I seek forgiveness from Allah, and the person's rebuking the name of Allah. So a lot of Muslims can't understand, how can you be speaking about Allah and talking about forgiveness? Like, I know what you're doing, but he knows what he's doing is wrong. He's not saying, oh, but technically, he knows what he's doing is wrong, but they were still Muslim. So it wasn't like they were excommunicated. They wasn't trying to justify it. And then you also had some scholars like, and this is why, again, it's important to understand the context of why, even like how Sufism came about. I think Al-Ghazali touched upon it, and other scholars, early scholars. It was because of the hedonism of the lifestyle of many of the Umayyads. So they're responding to that, and that's why some of them even said we're abstaining from women, because a lot of the Muslims of that time were just having debauchery sex, promiscuous sex, drinking alcohol. So you had a reaction to that. The same way we talk about how red pill was a reaction to feminism and stuff. These things do not come out of a vacuum. But when we look at Islamic history, and this is where, again, maybe the Islamic teachers and preachers to maybe not somewhat romanticize the past, because when people do come across, oh, but this great Muslim or this scholar, and then he did this, it's like they can't comprehend it. And again, maybe because the environment I came about, like, what is right, what is wrong, we don't try and justify it. I'll give you an example. So when I was in uni, this is a long, long time ago, one of my friends, obviously I'm Muslim, one of my friends who was then become quite militant, right? But somewhat still somewhat still would do engage in certain activities. So we went to was in a nightclub. I was drinking apple juice. So I was in the nightclub, and then he was next to me. Then he saw some girls and he said, "Astaghfirullah, haram, haram, haram." I was like, "What's up, what happened?" He said, "Such and such. What's she doing there? Because it was a Muslim girl. What's she doing? It's haram. I looked at him, I said, but we're not supposed to be here as well. And so it's different. We can do da'wah and we can marry Christians and Jews. I'm like, stop lying to yourself. This is a problem. I said, at least know what you're doing. Own it. You know it's wrong. See, I'm not just, but we know it's wrong. But when you start to play this mental halal gymnastics that, and you're saying other people what they're doing is haram, you're doing the same thing. And he's saying this with a cup of Jack Daniels in his hand. And then he would say Bismillah and drink it. I'm like, what? This is, or at least what you're doing is wrong. You know it's wrong, but don't start trying to justify. And I think also, actually, to be fair, I've noticed a number of Muslims nowadays, they will like question like something that you're doing and saying, oh, but do you know that's halal, that's haram? Yeah, it might be haram, but don't judge me. Don't judge Islam based on my actions or what I'm saying. I'm not the criteria. So because of that, I think a lot of Muslims feel they need to. Naturally, they react in a defensive way and try and justify. Oh, but there's an opinion that says I'm allowed to do such and such. There's an opinion that says such and such. Rather than saying, okay, if you take the opinion that that's haram, okay, maybe if you want to advise him, you can, but leave him be. And I think, especially if you're in Muslim majority countries, you see different types of Muslims. Some were outwardly very strict, some were not, but they're all Muslims. Whereas I think in Western countries, because we're a minority, the practicing people, they have to kind of like be the ideal, or we've got one ideal image of what it means to be Muslim. I think that also kind of needs to kind of somewhat change. So we don't go into the, I'm somewhat stereotypical, the archetype of like how the Jews were, as described, in being very legalistic, and the story of they were told not to work on the Saturday, on the Sabbath. So what do? On the Friday they pull out the tents, and then they come on the Sunday to collect the fish. You're not deceiving Allah, you're deceiving yourself. And then the other extreme is we can become like archetype, like the Christians, where it's just about your relationship with Allah. You don't have to worry about the law. It's nothing about, it's all about and that's where you see those two extremes, and that Allah warns us about in terms of archetype. Don't go to those two extremes. You could argue being very legalistic, and the other extreme is being, you could say, very spiritual, to the point where the rituals and the laws don't mean anything. And that's also something that we kind of need to be cognizant of, because as much as some people might lambast stereotypical, you could say, Salafis, rigid in terms of like their understanding of the letter of the law, at least that there's some consistency in that respect. And then the other extremes, like some who, like you could say, stereotypical lax Sufis, who maybe just think, oh, all of these laws we don't, as long as I'm connected to Allah, that's the most important thing. There's always this fight amongst scholars, whether it's like you could say the traditionalists and somewhat like say the spiritual Sufis, where they're kind of like, what is it, how much do you go into trying to understand ethics and the spirit of the law, and how much you need to stick to like the letter of the law? And I'm sure you're both of an age where you went through, or you probably saw the stage of, you go to certain mosques and people asking you, your trouser leg, why isn't it above your ankles? And that was a big discussion. Or like, why have you, like, your one, was it qadars? And that were big talking points then, not so much nowadays. But we went through that. And again, this is just something else that, or this whole Sufi Salafi, going back and forth. So we'll go through something. This is just like another, like the whole gender thing. This is just something that the Muslim need to traverse. But the fact that we're having more conversations, I think people are listening, hearing, and questioning things. I think that's good.
I also wanted to ask specifically, I know we talked about Misyar, but I also want to ask about polygamy, because we hear it a lot. We talk about other people, mention it, sheikhs talk about it, and sometimes it does, I feel, get instrumentalized for a certain agenda. So I'm just curious, I wanted to ask, what is polygamy? How did polygamy look like in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and essentially how is it utilized or weaponized in today's day and age?
Bismillah. Yeah, so polygamy, ta'addud zawjat, multiple wives, is the default position, is that it's permissible in Islam, but under strict conditions. Now, Allah mentioned in the Quran that men are allowed to have up to 4 wives, obviously at the same time. but with a strict condition that as long as he can be just towards those wives. Now, traditionally, how scholars have understood what it means to be just is they speak about financial maintenance and the number of nights you spend with each wife. That's how generally that's their understanding of what it means to be just, and from the understanding, obviously, studying the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But there are also scholars who speak about it's not just about financial responsibility. Also, one needs to think about the emotional welfare of the wives. And the reason why they say that is because if you look at the example of the Prophet, for example, there were some women from the Ansar who he didn't marry, and people used to ask him, why do you not marry the women from the Ansar? And he said that because they were extremely jealous, meaning they couldn't handle polygamy. There was one woman who the Prophet married. They didn't consummate the marriage, but then when her family found out, and some of her tribe, and she said that you wouldn't be able to handle his multiple wives and they're extremely jealous, then she went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and then asked, can the marriage be annulled? And the Prophet annulled the marriage. So that's an example of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Although, yes, in the default position, it's allowed to have multiple wives, there's some women who either doesn't want it or can't handle it. He didn't impose it or enforce it on anyone. And similarly, even if you look at his great-granddaughter, she put in a contract that any man that she marries cannot take a second wife. And that's something that many of the Maliki scholars, they use that position that a woman has the right to put in a marital contract that a man cannot take another wife, or if he does take another wife, either she needs to take his permission, he needs her permission, or she can get a divorce. So this whole idea that men can take up to 4 wives, yes, it's allowed under strict conditions, but generally speaking, women also do have the right to, if they want to stay in a monogamous relationship, they're completely allowed to do that. If they want to leave a man who wants to take a second wife, it's fine. But one thing I also want to stress is that during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, although polygamy was practiced, it was also a cultural norm. And also, it was seen as a responsibility. It wasn't just about male lust. It wasn't just about men collecting multiple sexual partners. And the verse which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about polygamy, because again, just by way of background, polygamy was unrestricted prior to Islam, where the Arabs, they can marry, as many women as they like. There was one companion who had up to I think about 10 wives. And when the verse came in restricting that amount to 4, then the Prophet told him that you can only keep 4 of those women as wives. So again, it's just understanding that polygamy was a cultural norm. It was something that wasn't just about male lust. And even, like I said, the verse which Allah speaks about polygamy, it's mentioned in the context of orphan girls or orphan children. And they're thinking about the mothers as well. So again, I'm not saying that polygamy is just restricted to widows and divorced women, because that would be disingenuous if I were to say that. But it's about the emotional welfare of the women. And it's something that even how you should look at polygamy is that it gives every woman, or most women, the right or the opportunity to marry a man, not that it's about men collecting multiple sexual partners. So again, I'm not against polygamy. And again, in Nigeria, where I come from, it's a cultural norm, but it's not like everyone does it. But again, if a man has the means, financial means, and he's transparent, and there are many women who don't mind or would consider marrying a man who's already married. But what a lot of women, they complain about, especially nowadays, is the way it's been done, the way Muslims men are practicing it, where there's a lot of deceit. It's basically a lot of men are just using it to justify having an affair. And a lot of what I've come across is that it's not that the men want a second wife, they want a second class wife, meaning they want a wife who's going to relinquish her rights and he can just go as he pleases and have sexual relations with her. That's kind of, so you want like a drive-through marriage. And that's the problem, which again is causing a lot of issues amongst many Muslims nowadays, in terms of women in particular, they're aversion to polygamy because they've seen how it's been practiced, where it's not done in a transparent manner, how it was done during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And also the men during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, they gave women the choice, and they're very open in terms of what their intentions were. Whereas again, nowadays, especially in cultures or communities where polygamy is not the norm, if anything, I would argue that the men need to be more transparent, open, if he wants to potentially think about taking a second wife, or if it's something that he wasn't thinking about when they first got married, but now later on he's thinking about it, he should be very open and transparent, rather than doing like these backdoor polygamous marital relationships. And again, if you read what many of the classical scholars have said, from Ash-Shafi'i and Nawawi and the like, they said that polygamy is not even a sunnah. Marriage is a sunnah, polygamy is not a sunnah. But nowadays, people will say that polygamy is a sunnah, meaning that, and again, this is like for Muslims to understand, when we talk about sunnah, it's got different meanings. the linguistic meaning is a path or way. In a Islamic law sense, is something that is like recommended or highly encouraged. So when people say polygamy is a sunnah, it's like they're playing with terms, because classically what the scholars meant is that it's a sunnah mean the prophet practiced it, not mean it's something that's highly recommended or there's more reward for having multiple wives. But in terms of from a religious perspective, do you get more rewards for having multiple wives? Many of the scholars, like Ash-Shafi'i, who said, no, it's not. It's, you know, you don't. It's actually marriage, which is a sunnah. And he actually said that because of Allah mentioned in another verse that even if your ardent desire, you wouldn't be able to be just to multiple wives. He said because there's a danger that men won't be able to be just to multiple wives, it's better to remain with one wife. And that's what Allah concluded the verse with. So again, but I would just say again, the way Muslims nowadays romanticize polygamy, and especially if you know people who've come from a polygamous household, if you've practiced polygamy or you've seen it firsthand, you know it's not the way a lot of people, especially preachers and some scholars, the way they kind of romanticize it, and it's about just having a roller deck of women or they're there just to please you. So again, with the way we've kind of like really sullied the practice, because polygamy in of itself, we shouldn't look at it like it's something that is backwards or something that is wrong. It's a type of marriage the same way monogamy is a type of marriage. But again, there should be transparency, there should be open communication. And if we're going to be honest, in some Muslim countries, especially where polygamy is not allowed, many scholars will argue that it's not allowed Islamically to take a second wife, because you have to follow the laws of the land. But this is where Muslims will pick and choose certain parts of the Sharia, where they'll say, I don't follow the law of the land, I follow the Sharia, and Allah allows me to take up to 4 wives. Yeah, that's true. But then how are you going to, Allah speaks about being just and being equitable between the wives and treating them fairly. But you've got one wife who's a legal wife, generally speaking, because you can only register one marriage in many Western countries. And the second wife then becomes like a second-class citizen. Then she doesn't have any legal protections. So this is also something that people need to be honest with themselves in terms of how they're going to go about this. What some brothers do, then they will say, okay, then I'm not going to register any of my marriages. You can do that, but at least you'll, again, be upfront, especially with the first wife, because whether people like or not, as much as whether you think polygamy is a sunnah or not, or something that you want to do, it's a risk. Because when you take that second wife, it's a risk to your first marriage. It can end your first marriage. It can definitely destroy the first marriage, and it can also destroy not only your wife, but also your children, if you have any children with your first wife. And people need to be very realistic and not be idealistic when they talk about polygamy, because I'll hear brothers, and I was speaking to one brother recently, and he said that he was talking about, how women have been westernized and feminism, and they're not accepting polygamy, and how he was made homeless because he took a second wife. And he took a second wife, he married a widow. He said, I was following the sunnah. I said, but how did you go about it? He said, obviously, well, I didn't tell her. I said, you didn't tell her? He said, no. I said, when did she find out? He said, she found out like about 6 months later. One of her friends saw me with my second wife and then called her. And then her friend told my wife that he's having an affair. And then when my wife found out, she was irate and this and that. And I said, look at the embarrassment, the humiliation, the hurt that you've caused her. And then you expect her to just accept it. And then now you're surprised that I'm not saying it's right for her to kick her out of the house and things like that, but some of the brothers, some of the way they just, again, I don't understand it. It's just like, and I told brothers, like, okay, imagine you have a child, you don't spend no time with that child whatsoever, you abandon that child, and then you come maybe 15 years later and then expect that child to be completely obedient and say it's your Islamic right. That is never going to happen. I'm not saying Islamically that child should disobey you, but the reality, that's not going to happen because of the abandonment issues that you've caused that child. But brothers, again, for every reason, they just think that because Islamically Allah's given me this right, and it's not a right, it's a responsibility, this concession that you can have up to 4 wives, they think they can abuse, the trust of the marriage contract and go out, behind the woman's back and think the woman's going to be completely fine with it. And even if you tell her beforehand, she still might be upset. She probably will be upset. And we can't romanticize again the sunnah, because many of the Prophet's wives did not like the Prophet marrying his second or third wife. Of course, they didn't say it was haram or anything, but they didn't like it. But he, of course, was very upfront, and they knew that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was someone who was and especially latter years, that he might take a second or multiple wives, when some women who would, like Aisha would see, and she said that this is the type of woman that the Prophet might marry, because they knew who he was, but he was never deceiving any of his wives. He wasn't manipulating them. He wasn't weaponizing hadiths. And again, this is something that we need to be. And again, I don't know why. Maybe when I was younger, polygamy was like a fantasy, but when you get older, it's just like it's a lot of the people that speak about it is quite pathetic. Again, if you're a teenager in your early 20s, I can understand, again, a lot of it's immaturity and stuff like that. But brothers in their like 30s, 40s, and some in their 50s that are still pushing it, and again, especially understanding the world that we're living in, and a lot of them cannot afford it, because again, I work by trade as a chartered accountant, and when I was working as an auditor for a local council or government body, we had a number of women who would come, hijab wearing, niqab wearing women, and they would always come every couple of years, and they were asking for a bigger house. And when they were questioned and say, okay, how can we need a bigger house because I've got another child? Then when they would say, oh, but I thought you were single. He said, I don't know who the father of my child is. And I knew some of these women. Some of these women were married. They were from the community. And these brothers, some of them imams, religious, so-called religious. And this is the perception that people, non-Muslims, have of Muslims. So much so that the way that the non-Muslims will just talk about, Muslim women, hijab wearing, some niqab wearing, it's like, in a very despicable, like, is this what your religion teaches? To be lying and deceiving and doing benefit fraud in the name of it's a man's right, and even many of these men aren't even working themselves. And it's just like all of that harm that you're causing, and the corruption and the lying and deceit, and you think this is permissible just based on your idea that this is to preserve your chastity so you don't commit adultery, rather than speaking about you need to maybe control yourself, you need to develop or practice sexual discipline, you need to not see women just purely as vessels for your sexual pleasure. This is more of the conversation that I think we need to have, especially given that a lot of the verses in the Quran and the hadiths speaks more about teaching men or encouraging men to practice sexual discipline. I don't know why, but for every reason, that's something that's not really spoken about. We speak more about polygamy when the reality, even majority of the Muslim world, most people are not polygamous. Most people are not in polygamous relationships. So I don't know. Again, I'm not having a go at you for bringing this up, but it's a topic that it's like a hypothetical, like most people are not going to engage in it. And those that do, if you look and speak to like a lot of what is like the harm that is caused, again, and a lot of it's because of there's no transparency and go buying the wives back, or a lot of it, and it's and again, if you cannot, and the Quran is very clear, if you can't be just to multiple women, if you can't be fair to multiple women, if you can't treat them fairly, polygamy is haram for you. You can't take a second wife. So it should be very straightforward. But again, if you want some, fatwas that's just going to say, if you fear committing adultery, then it's obligatory for you to marry, then people would cherry pick, their rationale for taking a second wife. But I just think, again, Allah knows best, but I just think it's something that brothers need to be more mature in having this conversation and not be deceitful, to be transparent if you're going to do it, and not be deceiving the government that you're living in and then fraudulently claiming benefits for a second and third wife, because you really and truly you're not entitled to it. Allah knows best, but I just think that, again, it's caused way more harm than good, especially in the Western world. And again, it's not a blanket statement saying it's haram, because a lot of brothers, especially that I speak to, that are in da'wah or like imams and stuff, they look at it like one brother, he said to me, brother, you don't understand. I'm helping the ummah. I said, how are you helping the ummah? He said, there's so many unmarried women that are out here that need a husband. Who's going to marry these women? So I said, oh, so you're volunteering yourself to be the Samaritan. He said, if I don't do it, no one's going to marry them. I'm just like, okay, stop. You know what? And this is a brother who is a serial divorcer, meaning he's had multiple marriages. And in his mind, it's completely permissible because, the women, and a lot of them enter this marriage by like way of Misyar, where they just forego their rights. And oftentimes those women like leave the religion of Islam or stop practicing altogether. But for whatever reason, the brother doesn't even think he's inflicting harm because he thinks it's halal. Because again, from a legalistic perspective, it's halal, meaning they're legal religious unions. but the harm that he's causing and destruction, he doesn't see that as part of Islam, which is again extremely problematic and wrong, you know.
SubhanAllah, I think there's a lot there, and it's a lot of very pertinent topics that need to be discussed. The one that stuck to me as well at the beginning you mentioned, and I wasn't aware about this. I knew there was some nuance that I wasn't across, but it was actually very interesting that you talked about hadith where the Prophet ﷺ was actually acknowledging women, certain tribes like the Aus and the Khazraj, like who had more tendency to be jealous, and actually factoring that into the decision making. Because from my personal experience, a lot of people shame women to be jealous. When it comes to jealousy, they shame women's jealousy. When it comes to something like polygamy, it's like it's un-Islamic because polygamy is halal. It's come back to that kind of understanding, that black and white kind of legalistic understanding, where it's like, no, polygamy is halal, therefore you can't be jealous because it's halal. Like, it doesn't actually make sense because they're not, you can't categorize as the same. Like, something can be halal and it can make you feel a certain way, but that doesn't, like, it doesn't have to contradict in the way that I guess many sheikhs or imams talk about it, or even just lay Muslims, to be honest, when they try to weaponize it in that situation. Because my personal experience has been that I actually know someone, and I know him really well. We're having this discussion, whatever, about polygamy, and he was saying that basically, like, it was that kind of back and forth, like, why can't women marry multiple men? Why, what I mean? Like, wouldn't a man get jealous naturally? Like, if we use that example in that situation, like, the men will get jealous, right? They want the women for themselves, this and that. So why can't we think of it as if, women can get jealous or are permitted to get jealous when a man does take a second wife? And in this case, normally it's done behind the back anyway. So there's no lack of there's a lack of transparency, and that guy is just like, no, but Islamically, polygamy is allowed, and men, obviously, you can't, a female can't have multiple husbands, so therefore, that female jealousy isn't permitted in that context. So, like, it doesn't actually make sense because we aren't aware. I'd say many lay people aren't aware of the example you just mentioned, that the Prophet actually factored in the jealousy into the conversation to make it informed decision. And this is like hikmah, right? Like, this is how it should look like. Like, we should have decisions informed, with that hikmah. And coupled with what you're saying, like, in this day and age, it is uncommon. Like, it's not the norm. Like, back then, Prophet's time, as you mentioned, they could marry so many wives, and now there was a restriction at that context. So that obviously context is so different to now, where it's like literally like you don't hear, it's not the norm at all, especially in the West, like, to have people have multiple wives. So that's something that actually needs to be factored in, and we should, as men, I guess, as Muslim men, we should validate that kind of emotions and feelings of women when they do have these conversations, that jealousy that happens, because it's normal. Like, it's a normal human behavior. But yeah, I just wanted to ask you about that, like your comments regarding that, because I don't think it gets talked about at all, to be honest. Like, it gets sidelined, if anything.
Yeah, and I think even like the term that people use it a lot, like what your friend used about Islamically. I think we use the word Islamically very flippantly. And what I mean by that, because when we think about Islam or what's Islamic thing to do, for me, that's the most moral and ethical thing to do. Islam should be linked to the ethics and the highest thing, the best thing to do. But generally, when people use the words Islamically, it's like the default legalistic thing to do. So because it's technically halal from a legalistic perspective, the default, and I say the default position, because again, for someone who cannot afford to maintain multiple women, or he cannot be just, it's haram for him to take a second wife. So for that individual, it's not allowed for him to practice polygamy. Or as some scholars say, if you're in a country where polygamy is illegal, then it's haram for you to take a second wife Islamically, because Islam tells you to follow the law of the land. Likewise, if someone were to say, and people, even scholars, they pick and choose what they want to say. You have to follow the law of the land and what you can follow the Sharia. So things like female circumcision, scholars will say, because they know that you can go to prison if you practice female circumcision on your child, they will say you have to follow the law of the land. Even though some scholars may have said that it's permissible, or some scholars may have said that it's obligatory. I don't believe it is, but I'm just saying they were very clear. They say that you cannot practice it, even if you believe that it's Islamically allowed, right? They were very, very clear. So to follow the law of the land. Likewise, if a man of 55 years of age wants to marry a girl of 16 or 14, no scholar in the West would even say that Islamically, you're allowed to do that. They won't use, Islamically, there's no such thing as age of consent from Islamic perspective. They'll be very clear because they know, A, you're going against the law of the land, and B, it's totally unacceptable in this day and age. It's culturally and socially totally unacceptable, and they won't get away with endorsing that type of relationship. Although, yes, those type of relationships happened even maybe in our parents or before our parents' generation, but they won't say it's haram. I'm not saying it's haram, but they won't even say that Islamically you can do that. So again, people will pick and choose. And again, as a man, let's be honest, because it serves men's interests in many cases. So that's why they would use and they won't talk about that women do have a right, like he mentioned, to be validated and understand and respect their emotions and feelings, and understand and respect that some women cannot want polygamy, and that's completely fine. And again, I'm just wondering, some of these people, are they not familiar with the seerah? Because many, like I said, many of the Prophet's wives were upset with it. They openly expressed it, they were upset. But again, the way, Muslims understand the religion is that they think if you are upset with this, because it's mentioned in the Quran, that means you're going against Allah and His Messenger, and that means therefore you're a kafir. And there's one scholar that I follow, he was talking about there's Islam which Allah and His Messenger speaks about, or Allah speaks about, and there's Islam which the scholars kind of have concocted. Not all, but some. And it's like a lot of the rules and the rigidity, you won't find it in the first and second and third community. You find a lot of that came later on when the Islam or the Islamic law became codified. That all of these rules, again, it's not to say that I'm just saying, just think rationally. Just even think about like the way scholars generally speak about male-female interactions, what you can and can't do. Realistically speaking, if you were to go back in time, do you think that was practical? Like everyone was implemented that way? I just don't believe it, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. But what they're presenting is like even like when you study the books of wudu, evolution, they'll speak about like, even though there's books that will say that even if like the dinar, amount of a dinar that you haven't, that's not wet on your face or your wudu is like invalid. And she's like, do you think people in the desert that had even limited water themselves were going into such detail, making sure even like in between, like people have OCD when they do wudu, it's like, where does that come from? We can do it because we've got abundance of water, but do you think in the past they were like that? When you look at wudu, what is it? It's more of it's a ritualistic act for purification, but not literally. If you haven't touched every part of your palm or in between your fingernails, or like the conversation about nail polish that Muslim scholars will speak at length about, that technically nail polish, you can't pray or do wudu with nail polish on because water has to go into the fingernail. And it's just like, this is when you go into the technique, like the details of the law. But again, do you think honestly people of the past will go into that length? And again, you do find these, again, when you study a lot of the books, and again, this is not to cast any aspersions against our tradition or fiqh, but it's just understanding that some of these intellectual conversations, they were really just amongst intellectuals and scholars debating themselves, whereas the general public weren't really involved or aware to the level of detail the way we are. So when people say things like, oh, it's Islamically, they will go by, there's a scholar I'm not going to mention from Saudi, and it's mentioned in one of his books that anyone who dislikes or goes against polygamy is a kafir. A prominent scholar, Salafi scholar, said that. So they use that. But I know what he meant. He meant like, in terms of, if you're rejecting it, like if you reject one part of the book of the Quran, effectively you're rejecting all of it. So that, but people are misinterpreting. I'm giving the scholar the benefit of the doubt. He didn't mean that if someone is upset, if a woman is upset with her husband taking a second wife, she's rejecting polygamy institution as itself, or if she says, I don't want polygamy for myself. But that's how brothers will take, if you're rejecting polygamy, you're rejecting my right to take a second wife. That means you are going against the book of Allah. That means if you're going against the book of Allah, that means you're rejecting Allah. That means you're a kafir. And this is where, if you understand the deen, if you understand the Quran, if you understand the seerah, you know that you're just playing, with the religion. And again, this is where education is extremely important, because you will find these people, both happens to men and women who do this, who weaponize the deen for their own desires.
I think because I don't want to be painted by many people that maybe are new to this kind of conversation as like we're just trying to be too feminist, quote unquote, right? In saying that, I think our perspective, generally, what we agree on is that if you happen to do polygamy, like we don't have anything wrong, we don't find any issue with that because that is, it's in our tradition. But it's more so about being transparent, being upfront, and also validating, the current wife's kind of situation when it comes to these conversations. Because yeah, like there's an aspect of jealousy that needs to be taken into consideration, as you brought up, like, and we have instances of the process I'm having to deal with that and addressing that as well. And I think also if we talk about this current context of polygamy, it's very sexualized. We view it in a sexualized way. Like the people that talk about, they talk about it as like a throwaway comment that I know I've seen you actually do some clips on this as well. Like, it causes anxiety for the wife. And because ultimately, like, the wife wants to feel protected, secure, feel like, they're probably liking the way life is currently, and they don't want a spanner in the works, so to speak, right? And I think that's a pretty normal thing to feel like you don't want to feel some, sort of agitation when it comes to possible change and this and that. And that needs to be accepted, right? So like going about in the way that I have seen it gone about, which is throwaway comments, kind of bringing anxiety, doing it secretly, this kind of stuff. It's like not befitting, I feel like, as a Muslim, or as much as, you're trying to justify it, trying to find loopholes, like as long as you're upfront with it. And I think it's not to also, like, if someone partakes in it in the context of, yeah, they were upfront and this and that, I'm not saying like, they can't do it for, I guess, non-sexual reason. Of course, like you can do it for that reason too. There's nothing wrong with that. It's more so understanding that in the time of the process, like when there was polygamy occurring, like there's that Sahabi, for example, who is doing that. They're taking on more responsibility. Essentially, it's not just about sexual relations, this and that. It's like he's possibly taking her and her extended, family into his wing so that he can take care of them, as you mentioned as well. So I think those aspects and perspectives should be taken into consideration, because back then and how they're taking responsibility and the way that they did polygamy is so different to now. Like now it's like, undercover, secretive, like for sexual reasons only, this and that. And you talked about, them abusing like the system to get more payments. Like this kind of stuff is like, it's absurd. Like how can you compare you doing polygamy in this day and age and you acting this way versus how the Prophet and the Sahaba did
And
it
there's
back then? Like
immaturity as
it's
well.
worlds apart. Like they were in wars and stuff like that. They were doing like so much. We all here like right now. We're just recording. We're just having a conversation. We're not like, let's be real. We're not going to wars. We're not like we're not doing Islam in that extent. So it just boggles my mind. Like sometimes, yeah.
And a lot of it's immaturity as well, because you find, and again, imams, sheikhs who'll be joking about taking a second wife. And I'm thinking to myself, and your wife is potentially there or listening, I'm just thinking, do you respect your wife to be joking about things like that? Because again, like you alluded to about the anxiety it can cause. Why would you, like, yes, we know every man can have up to 4 wives. Why would you talk about like in a joking way, or like even threaten it, like threaten your wife that way? That's where, again, this is not about halal and haram. This is about human decency. This is about seeing your wife as a human being that you respect. But I think some men don't respect women. It's just, or don't even like women, because they wouldn't speak about, like one of my friend, he said, again, it's not about halal and haram, because she said, okay, if I were to say, is it halal, is it allowed for me to tell my husband that when we divorce, I'm going to marry your brother or your best friend? Is that okay for me to say? Like, no man would, like, you'd be infuriated. Like, why would you say that? That's not a question of halal and haram. Yes, you technically can do it, but women don't behave that way. Or when you pass away, I'm going to ask for your brother if you would want to marry me. Like, what would you, if a woman were to be saying that, what would that cause in that marriage? And similarly, likewise for the men, if you're, joking about polygamy and taking this, again, if your wife is okay with that and she's doesn't mind that humor, fair enough. But I just think people need to be a bit more mature when talking about this, because again, it's very childish the way brothers will talk about, taking a second wife, especially again publicly, where you can cause anxiety or disrespecting your wife. And again, like you said, a lot of times people are just doing it for lust. Like there are a lot of imams who are womanizers. There are a number of preachers who have secret second wives. There are a number of da'is who use polygamy just for lust. It's now getting to the stage where it's more than an open secret. But the fact that they are, again, trying to justify in the name of Islam, and they're using or they're misusing the seerah to justify what is in reality affairs. Like, they're just affairs, but they just want to like legitimize them. And what is crazy is that the brothers will be patting him on the back and thinking, yeah, you know, like you're the man. Again, if you're 15, 12 years old, you might be impressed by that. But grown men, like if someone were to say to you, you know, I've got 30 kids, and you can be like, mashallah, that's, yeah. In this day and age, and he's making like $50,000 or £50,000 a year. And I said, yeah, I've got 30 kids. Are you gonna be impressed by that? And he said, I'm increasing the ummah. You know, any responsible person is not gonna be impressed by that. Someone who has, I have to be careful what I say, but someone who's not that educated, so to speak, might be impressed by that. Likewise, if someone is saying, yeah, I've got 2 or 3 wives, but you're not maintaining them, you're not looking after them, I'm telling them to go to the government and lie and say that they're single, even though they've got multiple children and they don't know who their children are. How as a man, how can you have any? Again, this is why I don't. This is not about religion. Just even as a man, where is your sense of shame that you're going to allow your wife to go outside and say that she doesn't know who the father of her child is, and she's going out in a religious garb, even if she's not wearing a religious garb? Even like your sense of shame, and you think that as long as because you've got your male friends who are egging you on and saying, "Mashallah, you're the man," you think that is masculinity, and on top of that, you think that's in line with what the Prophet brought and what the Quran is teaching or allows in terms of men having the concession to have up to 4 wives. It's just, again, that's what it's the mindset. And because a number of the brothers are quite immature, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, the way they view polygamy, that's why they don't feel any shame to kind of be talking about it, because they're not doing it by themselves. They're being encouraged. If you're in an environment, again, in male-only spaces in particular, where that's looked down upon and frowned upon, they probably wouldn't indulge in it. But if we're going to be completely honest, in a lot of male-only spaces, a number of men encourage that or just egg it on or think that, yeah, go and do it. And it's just like, okay, you go and do that. You're going to destroy your marriage, destroy the life of your children. You might not see them for a number of years. And no one's even telling them about the consequences. If they're aware of that and they go, okay, I might lose my marriage, fair enough, then so be it. But don't do it and then start complaining about the women or your children not wanting to see you because how you've dishonored their mother and disrespected their mom. And know the climate that, again, if you're marrying a woman or she's from a culture where that's not the cultural norm, you can't expect her to accept it like some of the companions who that was the cultural norm. And they also were very transparent.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know if you have any thoughts, Nadeem, regarding what Habib
Yeah, I'm just
mentioned.
thinking, like, you know, like, so, like from what you were saying, like, subhanAllah, like, how can you claim it's a sunnah, i.e., an act that is pleasing to Allah, and yet you're acting like a complete buffoon, right? Getting your wife to go and, as you say, like, claim she's single, and i.e., the implication is that she's being promiscuous and committing zina. Like, imagine she's going to someone who's a Muslim in the council, and like, so, like, it's just like, how can in any way, shape, or form that be pleasing to Allah? Like, how can you, even if you do believe it's a sunnah in that sense, how can you believe that is for it's just bonkers to me. It doesn't make any sense. SubhanAllah, man. It's but yeah, when you put it that way, like, you know, for a long time I've kind of like, you know, really thought that there's problems with, for a long time, I think, you know, some of the madkhali like shenanigans that they did, like, you know, going back 15, 20 years maybe, up until now, it's just like, but when you put the kind of like pragmatic frame around it about actually sisters are having to go and do this and lie and kind of like, you know, find housing for themselves and their kids, you just realize like it is a deep rot. It really is. And like, and I've been trying to conceptualize this for a little while now about kind of like why, and it, you know, it always comes back to this thing about the ego for me, and like, it is just an ego thing. Like, you're not getting close to Allah. You're not trying to get close to Allah by doing this. Like, if you were, you would be just. You would ensure that you have the means. You would be upfront about it. You'd be mature about it. But you're not. So you just cannot claim it's in any way, shape, or form getting close to Allah, and it's purely for your ego. It's purely for like, you know, your self-image, as you say, with the boys, because you want to be desirable. I don't know, maybe there's some dysfunction going on in your head, you know, whatever trauma you've not addressed. Wallahu alam, but it's, come on, man, like just the whole nonsense about you are trying to get close to Allah through this, you know, let's leave it, you know. Somehow, honestly, it's very very eye opening when you frame it like that, when you put it like that. It's very, very eye opening.
I wanted to ask as well, whilst we're on this topic, and I mentioned it briefly previously, that many Dawah figures do glorify polygamy as a solution to having mistresses and male sexual desires in this day and age, especially in the Western world. So, how would you address that point? Because they try to use polygamy as that institution that solves this problem. This is why, and it's funny. It's like they use that to be like, that's why Islam's the truth, because we have this institution called polygamy that will help with male desires, and the West has this problem because there's a lot of mistresses.
They're being completely disingenuous to the Quran, the Sunnah, and also the tradition, because also something that a lot of Muslims don't really talk about is that even if you look at many of the classical scholars, the way they view not only polygamy, that it's not a Sunnah. Many of the classical scholars, they believe that women have a higher sex drive than men. And this is based on some dubious reports and hadiths, that one that says that women's sexual desire is 9 times greater than men's sexual desire, but Allah gave women greater modesty or self-restraint. And there's another hadith that says that women's sexual pleasure is 99 times greater than men's sexual pleasure, but Allah gave women, again, more self-restraint or modesty. Now, because of this, and a lot of those ideas, they came from the ancient Greeks, and some scholars, they attribute it to the Prophet, some of them attribute it to Ali. Now, what you find is that a number of the scholars from the time of the Salaf up until like the 18th century, they were so concerned about female sexuality. And they believed that women were hypersexual in nature. So much so that they would use that the story of Prophet Yusuf and Zulaykha in the Quran, that this is an example of women being hypersexual, because this is a woman who's married to a so-called high-value man. She's in Egypt. She's got everything that she needs in terms of material items, and that's what women want. But she still was seeking another man, because that's women's nature. They're lustful. That's why, again, and then they'll talk about the women who cut their hands in Egypt when they saw Yusuf, who was extremely handsome. They were like, see, this is women's nature. They're hypersexual. They're lustful. So again, it's so interesting that, like, again, you read many of the classical scholars, they had so much anxiety around female sexuality, so much so they went to some extremes by encouraging female circumcision, claiming that it moderates women's sexual desire. And these are classical scholars from Ibn Taymiyyah, even recent scholars like Ibn Uthaymin. There's regurgitating, and even contemporary scholars or like da'is have just been saying this and just regurgitating the explanation that classical scholars gave, not based on the Quran or a clear, explicit verse from the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him. It's some explanation that scholars gave from around the 9th century, and they got that from the ancient Greeks, because Al-Jahid was one of the first that mentioned it, that this whole idea that female circumcision, it benefits women, because women, they're hypersexual by nature, they're extremely lustful. So this idea is like to moderate their desire by cutting part of their clitoris, makes them more chaste and more and their desire is in line with men. Whereas nowadays it's the opposite. Everyone's talking about men being hypersexual by nature, being very lustful. So even, and the way a number of the scholars, even when you read books of, like, I think 1001 Nights, they talk about it. It's like marriage is, or polygamy is there so you can have multiple children. It's not just about lust. But women are the ones that are hypersexual. Women are the ones that have sex more than, or want sex more than men, but they just shy and hide in it. So again, it's just really strange the way Muslims nowadays, who claim to be very, follow the tradition, they're arguing that the reason why Allah legislated polygamy was because out of a mercy for men, because men are hypersexual. Whereas many of the classical scholars, they didn't say that. That wasn't the reason. But I would argue that, of course, it's about social welfare. It's also about justice. But I'm just saying that even like the whole concept of fitna, right? Most men, they'll talk about, the hadith that women are men's greatest fitna, and they'll tie that to like sexual temptation. That's why they need to take 2 and 3 or 4 wives. If you read many of the classical scholars, when they talk about fitna, you know who was, what was the greatest fitna for a lot of scholars, for men? Beardless boys.
No.
Umrat.
I was going to say.
when I came across it, I was reading this. I was like, what is this? From scholars, from great scholars, and Nawawi, Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Ghazali, they were speaking about this Amrad. And I'm like, why are they speaking about these beardless boys? Scholars from the Salaf that were saying, if a beardless boy comes into your majlis, your religious circle, tell him to go away because he's more desirable, more tempting than 10 beautiful women. And I'm just thinking, where is this coming from? Now, again, because I'm quite a curious person, I'm trying to understand where this comes from. This didn't come from the Quran. It's not coming from the hadith of the Prophet, peace upon him. But during the time, especially like around the 8th, 9th century when Islam expanded, you had ideas from ancient Greeks and Persians about the whole idea of the greatest love is between an adult male and a young boy. And also, is it Plato also speaks about this. So some of the Muslims, they embodied, they took this and they will say, and this also became a fitna for them where they were lusting after boys. And also remember, a number of the women, they were even more segregated and secluded in their homes. So you had boys, especially again prepubescent boys who didn't have a beard, who were youthful looking. Some men or a number of men were starting to lust after them. So that's why scholars are speaking about this, because of the widespread problem of a lot of men lusting after young boys. Not that it's inherent in men that to be somewhat paedophilic or to be homosexual, but this was a real concern in their time. Nowadays, again, but that part no one really talks about. And this is where, again, why it's important to contextualize, because you could read this fatwa from scholars of the past saying, you know, the reason why it even struck me as well, not only because it sounded creepy. I mean, as you can see, I've got like a struggle beard, it doesn't connect like you brothers, mashallah. And when I was again in Egypt, I didn't even, now I've got a few whiskers, but before it was like nothing, like a baby's bottom. And when I came across some of these hadiths, I was thinking, oh, does that mean I can't study? Because they will say, if you've got a beardless boy, don't let him go into your majlis. So I was thinking, what does that mean? Like, am I allowed to study? But again, this is an example of where you need to contextualize the hadiths and understand what was considered to be a fitna and how attitudes has changed. Because during the time of Umar bin Khattab, there was one companion, I forgot his name. He was known to be extremely handsome. He was a fitna for the women, so much so that Umar told him to go to another city because there was a woman who recited poetry that I'm so in love with this man and I would want to make love to him. So when Umar heard about that, he said this man should leave the city because he's a fitna for the women. Whereas then later on, you had scholars that were speaking about young boys being a fitna for men. And nowadays, it's all the obsession is women are fitna for men. So again, it just depends on the culture and how attitudes change. That's something that I've always found quite interesting, because people make it out like, again, like polygamy solves the problem of unmarried women or divorcees or widows. And again, that's not the truth. That's not the truth. That's not the truth, because there's always been members of the community that have not married. Not everyone will marry. Allah will bless some people with marriage, other people He won't bless with marriage. And some people get married and get divorced. And this whole idea, like, because again, people speak about in the modern day context that, there's a lot of high divorce rates or increased divorce rates. In many parts of the Muslim world and Muslim societies are also high divorce rates. Again, this is not to encourage divorce, but I'm saying this idea, that people are putting out, that once if we allow polygamy or normalize it, no woman will be unmarried, everyone will be happy, everyone will follow the Quran and Sunnah. That's a utopia. That's never happened. I'll ask people, show me any society where all the women accepted, there was no issues, and people like lived happily ever after in this like polygamous unions. It's never existed, but for whatever reason, people who don't know history, or haven't studied history, or unaware of our tradition, they will believe that, yeah, because Allah permitted men to have up to 4 wives, men should have up to 4 wives. When you could argue, again, like the Shafi'i and many scholars said that it's better for men, especially in this climate, to marry one. But and also I think that if I'm going to be honest, some men, because they marry fairly young, and maybe they marry just out of lust, or maybe they don't think they don't marry the woman that they are connected to, and now they have like 2 or 3 children. Now they want to marry the woman that they connect with, that they love and they desire. But even with that, I always say to some of the brothers, okay, if you know that you can't be just to this wife in terms of emotionally, the first wife, why don't you let her go? And if you want to find the love of your life, so be it. I'm not saying just divorce, but I'm encouraging divorce. But if you know that you can't treat this woman like, and you want to find your soulmate, so to speak, at least give her, be honorable, be honest in terms of, don't just leave her as Allah mentions, mu'allaqa, hanging. Because a lot of brothers, again, like I said, they just want to hang on to the women, that even if she's not happy, I can't let her go. Some of it is because they fear in maybe losing their children or not seeing their children, but actions have consequences. You need to think, and this is where maturity comes into it. If you've made this woman your wife, you've had children with her, even if you haven't had children with her, but especially if you had children with her, she's going to be part of your life whether you like it or not. So you have a degree of, you have to have been mature in terms of how you handle any actions in terms of your decision making going forward, especially when it comes to polygamy, because that can jeopardize not only your relationship with the first wife but also your kids. And this is something that brothers need to be realistic and honest about, as opposed to saying things like, if we was in an Islamic state or a Muslim country, the women would never be allowed to get away with this, and it's because of the West has corrupted them. In many Muslim majority countries, they make it extremely difficult even for brothers to even practice polygamy, but they won't tell you that. But in the West, it's very easy. So that's why they want to pick and choose. They want to take the ease of how easy it is to take a second or third wife, especially if a woman is a convert, so she doesn't have like a wali, or she hasn't got a strong family support system. So they'll want to practice and divorce women very easily, and they'll say this is the sunnah, but they also want the protection, the legal protection in the Muslim majority countries where women cannot so-called abuse the system and take the husband to court and take him for child support and this, that, and the other, because that they're following the Sharia. So again, it's a lot of the brothers that are doing this, they're quite despicable, to be honest. Again, I just think, and I liked what Nadeem said about, he said, behaving like buffoons, because I was trying to be careful with my words, but yeah, just call it what it is. It's just the behavior, for people who have any level of education and maturity will know that this type of behavior is crazy. And it's like, it's just even crazy that we have to talk about it like this is not from our religion. This is not what Allah likes. This is not pleasing to Allah. The fact that we actually have to explain this, that just reflects the moral decadence of many so-called religious people. And I say so-called because I don't want to ascribe religion or religious people to this type of behavior. But this is the problem, that a lot of people aren't able to that think this is from the religion, you know. And Allah knows best. But I just think it's sometimes we have to be very clear in terms of calling out like these type of abuses and malpractices.
I know we've had you for a while, and we probably have to do another recording after this as well, in terms of like covering the stuff that I wanted to ask you about, because there's so much to talk about in this topic, mashallah. But to add to your point on, you mentioned about the beardless boys and homosexuality, that kind of is another whole can of worms where a lot of the Muslim community shun people that, you know, I guess associate being homosexual or have same-sex desires as like immoral. I mean, in the sense of like, you know, they jump to Lut alayhi salam and that kind of conversation without actually acknowledging that such phenomena can exist. And then when someone does acknowledge that, yes, I have these desires, they get looked as, you know, perverse people that have been corrupted because, I don't know, too much pornography, or there's this perception of them in a certain way that they've so degraded in a certain way that they have become homosexual, and not maybe acknowledging that this could be nature. And so like that kind of, that's a whole another can of worms that your example sort of brought up, because I think if we actually look at our tradition, what our scholars wrote, then it will really change a lot of perspectives. But we pick and choose according to the narrative we want for this current day and age to suit our sort of agenda. It's something that we have to be mindful of. But yeah, like, inshallah, I think we'll definitely have you on again to, you know, discuss all these kind of other topics as well, the points that I didn't get to ask you about, because I also wanted to ask you about Kama Sutra, all that kind of stuff, but inshallah for another time. But I don't know if you had any sort of final thoughts that you wanted to share before we wrap up the show, inshallah.
Yeah, just to encourage people to read. Don't be afraid to, especially read the history, because it'll open your eyes. And first and foremost, to read the Quran, because I'll start with the Quran, because a lot of these issues, especially in terms of like abusive practices, this is where people either take certain opinions out of context, or misunderstand or misinterpret certain hadiths, or weaponize certain hadiths. But if you've got a relationship with the Quran and you understand the Quran, a lot of the principles in terms of what Islam is based upon, in terms of like justice, encouraging people to be good, being ethical, being moral, all of these, being truthful, which is universal. If you've got that understanding, when you're coming across some of these issues, you compare it to the Quran, then you realize, that doesn't sound right, and I'll just leave it. And that's why, again, sometimes, not to say that if you come across like a hadith that doesn't makes sense, you dismiss it entirely. But stick with the Quran first and foremost, because that will save a lot of people. Because with even, which we didn't touch on, like words like the youth, which is also something that people are saying nowadays, like someone who's a cuckold. It's been weaponized. There are a lot of Muslims for hundreds of years that probably never heard of that word. Now, because it's number of these dawah bros are kind of throwing it and using it and misusing, even some scholars, and how some scholars, how the Prophet defined the youth is a man who doesn't care or doesn't mind if his wife has intimate relations with another man, meaning he is a cuckold, and essentially. And then some scholars, they said, it also refers to a man who lacks protective jealousy, ghayra or ghira, and they said that extends to anything. Even if a female member commits any sin and he's angry because of that, that's part of protective jealousy. And if a man is not protective jealous, does unprotective jealousy of his wife, even watching a music video, he's a dayuth. So you can see how the prophetic definition of a dayuth is totally different to how a number of like preachers and some scholars have kind of expanded it. And this is why it's extremely problematic. And even the hadiths about dayuth, they're not even authentic. Many scholars say there's weakness in it. But this is something like a principle that a lot of Muslims will use. And again, that's why I will say go back to the Quran, because a lot of these issues that people are using, like you mentioned earlier, when they speak about marriage, they don't cite the verse from Surah Al-Rum about how Allah's created spouses for us to find tranquility, and there should be love, mawadda wa rahma. They don't talk about that. A lot of it is about the rights. The angels will curse you. And again, not to say that these hadiths are inauthentic, but the context, and there's some understandings that people need to understand with them. So that's why I start with the Quran first and foremost, honestly, because that is Allah speaking to you. And that's what helped me during my studies when I was coming across a number of these issues from Islamic history and some problematic statements that scholars have said, whether they are misogynistic or racist. I was able to humanize them, because Allah doesn't mention that scholars are going to be protected and they are infallible. That's something that a number of Muslims unfortunately feel or believe, or they deify scholars when Allah didn't say that the scholars are ma'asum, they're protected in that light. So you can humanize them, and that which is incorrect or contrary to the Quran, you leave it. Likewise, you see that people have different human struggles that's mentioned in the Quran, and likewise you see that in our history. So that's why, again, the Quran first and foremost, read history as well. And none of these issues that we've spoken about, even though it might come across as controversial or shocking, it shouldn't hopefully decrease your iman or cause you to worry about our tradition, because number one, Allah's protecting the deen of Islam. We don't need individuals, even if, and I'm just the last thing I was going to say, there might be, and don't be surprised if there's some other scandals that come out of prominent figures who've engaged in these misyar or secret marriages. That should not affect your iman, because you shouldn't base your iman on any individual or individuals, even though they might have taught you the deen, you might have had love for them, because they may have disappointed you because of some actions that they've done. That shouldn't affect your iman. I'm saying that to say, because if other scandals that came out a few years ago affected a number of people's iman, and again, that's because the way they looked at these individuals was beyond above their station. And I'm just saying that's something that people also need to be mindful of, that again, people are human beings, scholars are human beings, preachers are human beings. Take the good, that which is you disagree with or that is wrong, you leave the rest, and again, you just keep it moving. That's what I would say. So but again, hopefully this conversation has been more beneficial than causing a lot of anxiety and harm to people, because sometimes with these issues, especially people are not familiar with them, or I don't want them to start second guessing or questioning every religious person or scholar, or thinking that they're a secret womanizer, or they're committing zina, or that's not the case. I believe that most religious people are upright, honest and decent, but you have a minority that's causing a lot of havoc, and they're quite vocal, and not enough men like us, I'll be honest, I think, are speaking out about it. So I do want to commend you for facilitating this conversation, to have these difficult conversations that I think need to be had, and also to benefit people, inshallah.
Inshallah, I appreciate your time, and we're definitely aligned in these kind of topics. So it was really an honor to have your time and to be able to unpack all these discussions. Inshallah, definitely we'll reach out again for another episode and cover a lot more. Like, we didn't even cover like manosphere, that side of things, or the alt-right, and how they've shaped sort of Muslim perceptions or perspectives as well within young Muslim men. So inshallah, we'll get into that. But thank you so much for your time. I'll put links to your socials in our show notes, inshallah. So I'll wrap it up there. So from our special, for our listeners, thank you for listening to our content. If you wanted to subscribe and listen to our content, check us out on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, iTunes. We're on other podcast platforms as well. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter as well, but mostly on Instagram and TikTok as well. So from our special guest, Habeeb Akande, we wish you all the best. This is Nadeem and I signing off. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.